Book 2. The Desert of Ice. Chapter 16. Northern Arcadia. On May 29th, for the first time, the sun did not set. It merely touched the horizon and then rose at once. The day was 24 hours long. The next day it was surrounded by a magnificent halo, a bright circle with all the colors of the prism. This apparition, which was by no means rare, always attracted the doctor's attention. He never failed to note the date and appearance of the phenomenon. The one he saw on that day was of an elliptic shape, which he had seldom seen before. Soon the noisy flocks of birds appeared. Bustards and wild geese came from Florida or Arkansas, flying northward with inconceivable rapidity and bringing the spring with them. The doctor shot a few, as well as 3 or 4 cranes and a single stork. However, the snow was melting everywhere beneath the sun. The salt water, which overran the ice field through the crevasses and the seal holes, hastened the melting. The ice which was mingled with salt water formed a soft slush. Large pools appeared on the land near the bay, and the exposed soil seemed to be a production of the Arctic spring. The doctor then resumed his planting. He had plenty of seed. Besides, he was surprised to see a sort of sorrel growing naturally between the dried rocks, and he wondered at the force of nature which demanded so little in order to manifest itself. He sowed some cresses, of which the young sprouts, 3 weeks later, were already an inch long. The heath began to show timidly its little pale, rosy flowers. In fact, the flora of New America is very defective. Still, this rare vegetation was agreeable to their eyes. It was all the feeble rays of the sun could nourish, a trace of the providence which had not completely forgotten these distant countries. At last it became really warm. June 15th the thermometer stood at 57 degrees. The doctor could hardly believe his eyes. The country changed its appearance. Numerous noisy cascades fell from the sunny summits of the hills, the ice loosened, and the great question of an open sea would soon be decided. The air was full of the noise of avalanches falling from the hills to the bottom of the ravines, and the cracking of the ice field produced a deafening sound. A trip was made to Johnson Island. It was merely an unimportant, arid, barren island, but the old boatswain was no less proud of giving his name to a few desolate rocks. He even wanted to carve it on a high peak. During this excursion, Hatteras had carefully explored these lands, even beyond Cape Washington. The melting of the snow sensibly changed the country. Ravines and hillocks appeared here and there, where the snow indicated nothing but monotonous stretches. The house and magazines threatened to melt away, and they had frequently to be repaired. Fortunately, a temperature of 57 degrees is rare in these latitudes, and the mean is hardly above the freezing point. By the middle of June the launch was far advanced and getting into shape. While Bell and Johnson were working at it, the others had a few successful hunts. Reindeer were shot, although they are hard to approach, but Altamont put in practice a device employed by the Indians of his own country. He crept over the ground with his gun and arms outstretched like the horns of one of these shy animals, and having thus come within easy gunshot, he could not fail. But the best game, the muskox, of which Parry found plenty at Melville Island, appeared not to frequent the shores of Victoria Bay. A distant hunt was determined on, as much to get these valuable animals as to reconnoiter the eastern lands. Hatteras did not propose to reach the pole by this part of the continent, but the doctor was not sorry to get a general idea of the country. Hence they decided to start to the east of Fort Providence. Altamont intended to hunt. Duke naturally was of the party. So, Monday, June 17th, a pleasant day, with the thermometer at 41 degrees, and the air quiet and clear, the 3 hunters, each carrying a double-barreled gun, a hatchet, a snow knife, and followed by Duke, left Doctor's house at 6 o'clock in the morning. They were fitted out for a trip of 2 or 3 days, with the requisite amount of provisions. By 8 o'clock Hatteras and his 2 companions had gone 8 miles. Not a living thing had tempted a shot, and their hunt threatened to be merely a trip. This new country exhibited vast plains running out of sight, new streams divided them everywhere, and large, unruffled pools reflected the sun. The layers of melting ice bared the ground to their feet. It belonged to the great division of sedimentary earth, and the result of the action of the water, which is so common on the surface of the globe. Still a few erratic blocks were seen of a singular nature, foreign to the soil where they were found, and whose presence it was hard to explain. Schists and different productions of limestone were found in abundance, as was also a sort of strange, transparent, colorless crystal, which has a refraction peculiar to Iceland spar. But although he was not hunting, the doctor had not time to geologize. He had to walk too quickly, in order to keep up with his friends. Still, he observed the land and talked as much as possible, for had he not there would have been total silence in the little band. Neither Altamont nor the captain had any desire to talk to one another. By 10 o'clock the hunters had got a dozen miles to the east. The sea was hidden beneath the horizon. The doctor proposed a halt for breakfast. They swallowed it rapidly, and in half an hour they were off again. The ground was sloping gently. A few patches of snow, preserved either by their position or the slope of the rocks, gave it a woolly appearance, like waves in a high wind. The country was still barren, and looking as if no living being had ever set foot in it. "We have no luck," said Altamont to the doctor. "To be sure, the country doesn't offer much food to animals, but the game here ought not to be over-particular, and ought to show itself." "Don't let us despair," said the doctor. "The summer has hardly begun, and if Parry met so many animals at Melville Island, we may be as lucky here." "Still, we are farther north," said Hatteras. "Certainly, but that is unimportant. It is the pole of cold we ought to consider, that is to say, that icy wilderness in the middle of which we wintered with the Forward. Now the farther north we go, the farther we are from the coldest part of the globe. We ought to find, beyond, what Parry, Ross, and others found on the other side." "Well," said Altamont, with a regretful sigh, "so far we've been travelers rather than hunters." "Be patient," answered the doctor. "The country is changing gradually, and I should be astonished if we don't find game enough in the ravines where vegetation has had a chance to sprout." "It must be said," continued Altamont, "that we are going through an uninhabited and uninhabitable country." "Oh, uninhabitable is a strong word," answered the doctor. "I can't believe any land uninhabitable. Man, by many sacrifices, and for generations using all the resources of science, might finally fertilize such a country." "Do you think so?" asked Altamont. "Without doubt. If you were to go to the celebrated countries of the world, to Thebes, Nineveh, or Babylon, in the fertile valleys of our ancestors, it would seem impossible that men should ever have lived there. The air itself has grown bad since the disappearance of human beings. It is the general law of nature which makes those countries in which we do not live unhealthy and sterile, like those out of which life has died. In fact, man himself makes his own country by his presence, his habits, his industry, and, I might add, by his breath. He gradually modifies the exhalations of the soil and the atmospheric conditions, and he makes the air he breathes wholesome. So there are uninhabited lands, I grant, but none uninhabitable." Talking in this way, the hunters, who had become naturalists, pushed on and reached a sort of valley, fully exposed, at the bottom of which a river, nearly free of ice, was flowing. Its southern exposure had brought forth a certain amount of vegetation. The earth showed a strong desire to grow fertile. With a few inches of rich soil it would have produced a good deal. The doctor called their attention to these indications. "See," he said, "a few hardy colonists might settle in this ravine. With industry and perseverance they could do a great deal, not as much as is seen in the temperate zones, but a respectable show. If I am not mistaken, there are some 4-footed animals. They know the good spots." "They are Arctic hares," shouted Altamont, cocking his gun. "Wait a moment," cried the doctor. "Wait a moment, you hasty fellow. They don't think of running away. See, they'll come to us." And, in fact, 3 or 4 young hares, springing about in the heath and young moss, ran boldly towards the 3 men. They were so cunning that even Altamont was softened. Soon they were between the doctor's legs. He caressed them with his hand, saying, "Why shoot these little animals which come to be petted? We need not kill them." "You are right, doctor," answered Hatteras. "We'll let them live." "And these ptarmigan, too, which are flying towards us," cried Altamont, "and these long-legged waterfowl." A whole flock of birds passed over the hunters, not suspecting the peril from which the doctor's presence saved them. Even Duke was compelled to admire them. They were a curious and touching sight, flying about without fear, resting on Clawbonny's shoulders, lying at his feet, offering themselves to his caresses, seeming to do their best to welcome their new guests. They called one another joyously, flying from the most distant points. The doctor seemed to be a real bird charmer. The hunters continued their march up the moist banks of the brook, followed by the familiar band, and turning from the valley they perceived a troop of 8 or 10 reindeer browsing on a few lichens half buried beneath the snow. They were graceful, quiet animals, with their branching antlers, which the female carried as well as the male. Their wool-like fur was already losing its winter whiteness in favor of the summer brown and gray. They seemed no more timid than the hares and birds of the country. Such were the relations of the first men to the first animals in the early ages of the world. The hunters reached the middle of the band without anyone flying. This time the doctor found it hard to restrain the instincts of Altamont, who could not calmly look on this game without a thirst for blood rising in his brain. Hatteras looked mildly at these gentle beasts, who rubbed their noses against the doctor's clothes. He was the friend of all the animals. "But," said Altamont, "didn't we come here to shoot?" "To shoot musk ox," answered Clawbonny, "and nothing else. We should have no need of this game. We have food enough, so let us enjoy the sight of man walking thus among these animals, without alarming them." "That proves they have never seen one before," said Hatteras. "Evidently," answered the doctor, "and so we can be sure that these animals are not of American origin." "And why so?" said Altamont. "If they were born on the continent of North America, they would know what to think of men, and they would have fled at the sight of us. No, they probably came from the north, from those unknown lands where our kind has never set foot, and they have crossed the continents near the pole. So, Altamont, you can't claim them as your fellow countrymen." "Oh," answered Altamont, "a hunter does not scrutinize so closely, and the game belongs to the land where it was shot." "Well, calm yourself, my Nimrod. As for me, I would rather never fire a gun in my life than alarm this timid population. See, even Duke fraternizes with the charming beasts. Come, we'll be kind when we can. Kindness is a force." "Well, well," answered Altamont, who sympathized but slightly with this sensitivity, "but I should be amused to see you armed with this kindness alone among a flock of bears or wolves." "Oh, I don't pretend to charm wild beasts," answered the doctor. "I have little faith in the enchantment of Orpheus. Besides, bears and wolves wouldn't come up to us like the hares, partridges, and reindeer." "Why not?" answered Altamont, "if they have never seen men?" "Because they are naturally ferocious, and ferocity, like maliciousness, begets suspicion. A remark which is true of man as well as of animals. A wicked man is distrustful, and fear is commonly found in those who are able to inspire it." This little lesson in natural philosophy ended the conversation. The whole day was passed in this northern Arcadia, as the doctor named the valley, with the consent of his companions, and that evening, after a supper which had not cost the life of a single inhabitant of the country, the 3 hunters went to sleep in a cleft of a rock which was admirably adapted for a shelter. Chapter 17. Altamont's Revenge. The next day the doctor and his 2 companions woke up after a perfectly quiet night. The cold, although not keen, increased towards daybreak, but they were well covered, and slept soundly under the watch of the peaceful animals. The weather being pleasant, they resolved to consecrate the day to a reconnaissance of the country, and the search of musk oxen. Altamont insisted on shooting something, and they decided that, even if these oxen should be the gentlest animals in the world, they should be shot. Besides, their flesh, although strongly flavored with musk, was pleasant eating, and they all hoped to carry back to Fort Providence a good supply of it. During the early morning hours nothing noteworthy took place. The land grew different in the northeast. A few elevations, the beginning of a mountainous district, indicated a change. If this new America were not a continent, it was at any rate an important island, but then they did not have to trouble themselves about its geography. Duke ran ahead, and soon came across some traces of a herd of musk oxen. He then advanced rapidly, and soon disappeared from the eyes of the hunters. They followed his clear barking, which soon grew so hasty that they knew he had discovered the object of their search. They pushed on, and in an hour and a half they came up to 2 of these animals. They were large, and formidable in appearance. They appeared much surprised at Duke's attacks, but not alarmed. They were feeding off a sort of reddish moss which grew on the thin soil. The doctor recognized them at once from their moderate height, their horns, which were broad at the base, the absence of muzzle, their sheep-like forehead, and short tail, their shape has earned for them from naturalists the name of overbass, a compound, and which expresses the two sorts of animals whose characteristics they share. Thick, long hair and a sort of delicate brown silk formed their fur. They ran away when they saw the two hunters, who came running up after them. It was hard to reach them for men who were out of breath after running half an hour. Hatteras and his companions stopped. "The devil," said Altamont. "That's just the word," said the doctor, as soon as he could take breath. "I'll grant they are Americans, and they can't have a very good idea of your countrymen." "That proves we are good hunters," answered Altamont. Still, the musk oxen, seeing they were not pursued, stopped in a posture of surprise. It became evident that they could never be run down, they would have to be surrounded, the plateau on which they were aided this maneuver. The hunters, leaving Duke to harass them, descended through the neighboring ravines, so as to get around the plateau. Altamont and the doctor hid behind a rock at one end, while Hatteras, suddenly advancing from the other end, should drive the oxen towards them. In half an hour each had gained his post. "You don't object any longer to our shooting?" asked Altamont. "No, it's fair fighting," answered the doctor, who, in spite of gentleness, was a real sportsman. They were talking in this way, when they saw the oxen running, and Duke at their heels. Farther on Hatteras was driving them, with loud cries, towards the American and the doctor, who ran to meet this magnificent prey. At once the oxen stopped, and, less fearful of a single enemy, they turned upon Hatteras. He awaited them calmly, aimed at the nearest, and fired, but the bullet struck the animal in the middle of his forehead, without penetrating the skull. Hatteras' second shot produced no other effect than to make the beasts furious. They ran to the disarmed hunter, and threw him down at once. "He is lost," cried the doctor. At the moment Clawbonny pronounced these words with an accent of despair, Altamont made a step forward to run to Hatteras' aid, then he stopped, struggling against himself and his prejudices. "No," he cried, "that would be cowardice." He hastened with Clawbonny to the scene of combat. His hesitation had not lasted half a second. But if the doctor saw what was taking place in the American's heart, Hatteras understood it, who would rather have died than have implored his rival's interference. Still, he had hardly time to perceive it, for Altamont appeared before him. Hatteras, lying on the ground, was trying to ward off the horns and hoofs of the two animals. But he could not long continue so unequal a struggle. He was about to be torn in pieces, when two shots were heard. Hatteras heard the bullets whistling by his head. "Don't be frightened," shouted Altamont, hurling his gun to one side, and rushing upon the angry animals. One of the oxen fell, shot through the heart, the other, wild with rage, was just going to gore the captain, when Altamont faced him, and plunged into his mouth his hand, armed with a snow knife, with the other he gave him a terrible blow with a hatchet on the head. This was done with marvelous rapidity, and a flash of lightning would have lit up the whole scene. The second ox fell back dead. "Hurrah! Hurrah!" cried Clawbonny. Hatteras was saved. He owed his life to the man whom he detested most in the world. What was going on in his mind at this time? What emotion was there which he could not master? That is one of the secrets of the heart which defy all analysis. However that may be, Hatteras advanced to his rival without hesitation, and said to him seriously, "You have saved my life, Altamont." "You saved mine," answered the American. There was a moment's silence. Then Altamont added, "We are now quits, Hatteras." "No, Altamont," answered the captain, "when the doctor took you from your icy tomb, I did not know who you were, and you have saved me at the risk of your own life, knowing who I was." "You are a fellow being," answered Altamont, "and whatever else he may be, an American is not a coward." "No, he is not," said the doctor, "he is a man. A man like you, Hatteras. And like me he shall share the glory which is awaiting us." "The glory of going to the North Pole," said Altamont. "Yes," said the captain, haughtily. "I had guessed it," exclaimed the American. "So you dared conceive of this bold design? You dared try to reach that inaccessible point? Ah, that is great. It is sublime. "But you?" asked Hatteras, hurriedly. "Were you not on your way to the pole?" Altamont seemed to hesitate about replying. "Well," said the doctor. "Well, no," answered the American. "No, tell the truth, and shame the devil. No, I did not have this great idea, which has brought you here. I was trying simply to sail through the Northwest Passage, that is all." "Altamont," said Hatteras, holding out his hand to the American, "share our glory, and go with us to the North Pole." The two men then shook hands warmly. When they turned towards the doctor, they saw his eyes full of tears. "Ah, my friends," he murmured, as he dried his eyes, "how can my heart hold the joy with which you fill it? My dear companions, you have sacrificed a miserable question of nationality in order to unite in your common success. You know that England and America have nothing to do with all this, that mutual sympathy ought to bind you together against the dangers of the journey. If the North Pole is discovered, what difference does it make who does it? Why stand bickering about English or American, when we can be proud of being men?" The doctor embraced the reconciled foes. He could not restrain his joy. The two new friends felt themselves drawn closer together by the friendship this worthy man had for them both. Clawbonny spoke freely of the vanity of competition, of the madness of rivalry, and of the need of agreement between men so far from home. His words, his tears, and caresses came from the bottom of his heart. Still, he grew calm after embracing Hatteras and Altamont for the 20th time. "And now," he said, "to work, to work. Since I was no use as a hunter, let me try in another capacity." Thereupon he started to cut up the ox, which he called the ox of reconciliation, but he did it as skillfully as if he were a surgeon conducting a delicate autopsy. His two companions gazed at him in amusement. In a few minutes he had cut from the body 100 pounds of flesh. He gave each one a third of it, and they again took up their march to Fort Providence. At 10 o'clock in the evening, after walking in the oblique rays of the sun, they reached Doctor's house, where Johnson and Bell had a good supper awaiting them. But before they sat down to table, the doctor said in a voice of triumph, as he pointed to his two companions, "Johnson, I carried away with me an Englishman and an American, did I not?" "Yes, Dr. Clawbonny," answered the boatswain. "Well, I've brought back 2 brothers." The 2 sailors gladly shook Altamont's hand. The doctor told them what the American captain had done for the English captain, and that night the snow house held 5 perfectly happy men. Chapter 18. The Last Preparations. The next day the weather changed. There was a return of cold. The snow and rain gust raged for many days. Bell had finished the launch. It was perfectly satisfactory for the purpose it was intended for, partly decked and partly open. It could sail in heavy weather under mainsail and jib, while it was so light as not to be too heavy a load on the sledge for the dogs. Then, too, a change of great importance was taking place in the state of the polar basin. The ice in the middle of the bay was beginning to give way. The tallest pieces, forever weakened by the collision of the rest, only needed a sufficiently heavy tempest to be torn away and to become icebergs. Still, Hatteras was unwilling to wait so long before starting. Since it was to be a land journey, he cared very little whether the sea was open or not. He determined to start June 25th. Meanwhile all the preparations could be completed. Johnson and Bell put the sledge into perfect repair. The frame was strengthened and the runners renewed. The travellers intended to devote to their journey the few weeks of good weather which nature allows to these northern regions. Their sufferings would be less severe, the obstacles easier to overcome. A few days before their departure, June 20th, the ice had so many free passages that they were able to make a trial trip on board of the new launch as far as Cape Washington. The sea was not perfectly free, far from it, but its surface was not solid, and it would have been impossible to make a trip on foot over the ice fields. This half-day's sail showed the good sailing qualities of the launch. During the return they beheld a curious incident. It was a monstrous bear chasing a seal. Fortunately the former was so busily occupied that he did not see the launch, otherwise he would certainly have pursued it. He kept on watch near a crevasse in the ice field, into which the seal had evidently plunged. He was awaiting his reappearance with all the patience of a hunter, or rather of a fisherman, for he was really fishing. He was silent, motionless, without any sign of life. Suddenly the surface of the water was agitated. The seal had come up to breathe. The bear crouched low upon the ice and rounded his 2 paws about the crevasse. The next moment the seal appeared, with his head above water, but he had not time to withdraw it. The bear's paws, as if driven by a spring, were clashed together, strangling the animal with irresistible force and dragging it out of the water. It was but a brief struggle. The seal struggled for a few seconds, and was then suffocated on the breast of his adversary, who, dragging him away easily, in spite of his size, and springing lightly from one piece of ice to another, reached land and disappeared with his prey. "A pleasant journey," shouted Johnson. "That bear has got rather too many paws." The launch soon reached the little anchorage Belle had made for her in the ice. Only 4 days were there before the time fixed for their departure. Hatteras hurried on the last preparations. He was in a hurry to leave New America, a land which was not his, and which he had not named. He did not feel at home. June 22d they began to carry to the sledge their camp material, tent, and food. They carried only 200 pounds of salt meat, 3 chests of preserved meat and vegetables, 50 pounds of pickles and lime juice, 5 quarters of flour, packets of cresses and carclearia from the doctor's garden, with the addition of 200 pounds of powder, the instruments, arms, and personal baggage, the launch, hawket boat, and the weight of the sledge itself. The whole weighed 1,500 pounds, a heavy load for 4 dogs, especially since, unlike the Eskimos, who never travel more than 4 days in succession, they had none to replace them, and would have to work them every day. But the travelers determined to aid them when it was necessary, and they intended to proceed by easy stages. The distance from Victoria Bay to the pole was 355 miles at the outside, and going 12 miles a day they could make the journey in a month. Besides, when the land came to an end, the launch would enable them to finish the journey without fatigue for dogs or men. The latter were well, and in excellent condition. The winter, although severe, ended favorably enough. Each one had followed the doctor's advice, and escaped from the diseases common in these severe climates. In fact, they had grown a trifle thinner, which gave a great deal of pleasure to Clawbonny, but their bodies were inured to the rigors of that life, and these men were able to face the severest attacks of cold and hunger without succumbing. And then, too, they were going to the end of their journey, to the inaccessible pole, after which their only thought would be of returning. The sympathy which bound together the 5 members of the expedition would aid their success in this bold trip, and no one doubted of their success. As a precaution, the doctor had urged his companions to prepare themselves for some time beforehand, and to train with much care. "My friends," he used to say, "I don't ask you to imitate the English racers, who lose 18 pounds after 2 days' training, and 25 after 5 days, but we ought to do something to get into the best possible condition for a long journey. Now the first principle of training is to get rid of the fat on both horse and jockey, and this is done by means of purging, sweating, and violent exercise. These gentlemen know they will lose so much by medicine, and they arrive at their results with incredible accuracy. Such a one who before training could not run a mile without being winded, can run 25 easily after it. There was a certain Townsend who ran 100 miles in 12 hours without stopping." "A good result," answered Johnson, "and although we are not very fat, if we must get thinner yet." "There is no need of it, Johnson, but without exaggerating, it can't be denied that training produces good effects. It strengthens the bones, makes the muscles more elastic, improves the hearing and the sight, so let us not forget it." In short, whether in training or not, the travelers were ready June 23d. It was Sunday, and the day was devoted to absolute rest. The time for departure drew near, and the inhabitants of Fort Providence could not see it approach without a certain emotion. It grieved them to leave this snow hut which had served so well to protect them, Victoria Bay, this hospitable shore where they had spent the last days of the winter. Would they find these buildings standing when they returned? Would not the rays of the sun melt away its fragile walls? In a word, they had passed pleasant hours there. The doctor, at the evening meal, called up to his companion's memory touching reminiscences, and he did not forget to thank heaven for its evident protection. At last the hour of sleeping came. Each one went to bed early, so as to be up betimes. Thus passed their last night at Fort Providence. Chapter 19. The journey northward. At dawn the next day Hatteras gave the signal for departure. The dogs were harnessed to the sledge, since they were well fed and had thoroughly rested. After a comfortable winter there was no reason for their not being of great service during the summer. Hence they were not averse to being put into harness. After all, these Greenland dogs are kind beasts. Their wildness was partly gone. They had lost their likeness to the wolf, and had become more like Duke, the finished model of the canine race. In a word, they were becoming civilized. Duke could certainly claim a share in their education. He had given them lessons and an example in good manners. In his quality of Englishman, and so punctilious in the matter of cant, he was a long time in making the acquaintance of the other dogs, who had not been introduced to him, and in fact he never used to speak to them, but after sharing the same dangers and privations, they gradually grew used to one another. Duke, who had a kind heart, made the first advances, and soon all the dogs were friends. The doctor used to pet the Greenland dogs, and Duke saw him do it without jealousy. The men were in equally good condition. If the dogs could draw well, the men could walk well. They left at 6 o'clock in the morning. It was a very pleasant day. After they had followed the line of the bay and passed Cape Washington, Hatteras gave the order to turn northward. By 7 the travellers lost sight of the lighthouse and of Fort Providence in the south. The journey promised well, much better than the expedition begun in the dead of winter in search of coal. Hatteras then left behind him, on board of the ship, mutiny and despair, without being certain of the object of his journey. He left a crew half dead with cold. He started with companions who were weakened by the miseries of an Arctic winter. He, too, eager for the north, had to return to the south. Now, on the other hand, surrounded by vigorous, healthy friends, encouraged and aided in many ways, he was starting for the pole, the object of his whole life. No man had ever been nearer acquiring this glory for himself and his country. Was he thinking of all this, which was so naturally inspired by his present position? The doctor liked to think so, and could hardly doubt it when he saw him so eager. Clawbonny rejoiced in what so pleased his friend, and since the reconciliation of the two captains, the two friends, he was the happiest of men. For hatred, envy, and rivalry were passions he had never felt. What would be the issue of this voyage he did not know, but, at any rate, it began well, and that was a good deal. The western shore of New America stretched out in a series of bays beyond Cape Washington. The travelers, to avoid this long curve, after crossing the first spurs of Mount Bell, turned northward over the upper plateaus. This was a great saving of time. Hatteras was anxious, unless prevented by seas or mountains, to make a straight line of 350 miles to the pole from Fort Providence. Their journey was easy. These lofty plains were covered with deep snow, over which the sledge passed easily, and the men in their snowshoes walked easily and rapidly. The thermometer stood at 37 degrees. The weather was not absolutely settled. At one moment it was clear, the next cloudy, but neither cold nor showers could have stopped the eager party. They could be followed easily by the compass. The needle was more active as they receded from the magnetic pole. It is true that it turned to the opposite direction and pointed to the south, while they were walking northward, but this did not in any way embarrass them. Besides, the doctor devised a simple method of staking out the way and thereby avoiding perpetual reference to the compass. When once they had got their bearings by some object 2 or 3 miles to the north, they walked till they reached it, when they chose another, and so on. In this way they had a straight road. In the first 2 days they made 20 miles in 12 hours. The rest of the time was devoted to meals and rest. The tent was ample protection against the cold when they were sleeping. The temperature gradually rose. The snow melted away in some places, according to the shape of the ground, while in others it lay in large patches. Broad pools appeared here and there, often almost as large as lakes. They would walk in up to their waists very often, but they only laughed at it, and the doctor more than any. "Water has no right to wet us in this country," he used to say. "It ought to appear only as a solid, or a gas. As to its being liquid, it's absurd. Ice or vapor will do, but water won't." They did not forget their shooting, for thereby they got fresh meat. So Altamont and Bell, without going very far away, scoured the neighboring ravines. They brought back ptarmigan, geese, and a few grey rabbits. Gradually these animals became very shy and hard to approach. Without Duke they would often have found it hard to get any game. Hatteras advised them not to go off farther than a mile, for not a day nor an hour was to be lost, and he could not count on more than 3 months of good weather. Besides, each one had to be at his post by the sledge whenever a hard spot, a narrow gorge, or steep inclines lay in the path. Then each one helped pull or push. More than once everything had to be taken off, and this even did not fully protect against shocks and damage, which Bell repaired as well as he could. The third day, Wednesday, June 26th, they came across a vast lake, still frozen by reason of its being sheltered from the sun. The ice was even strong enough to bear both men and sledge. It was a solid mirror which no Arctic summers had melted, as was shown by the fact that its borders were surrounded by a dry snow, of which the lower layers evidently belonged to previous years. From this moment the land grew lower, whence the doctor concluded that it did not extend very far to the north. Besides, it was very likely that New America was merely an island, and did not extend to the pole. The ground grew more level. In the west a few low hills could be seen in the distance, covered with a bluish mist. So far they had experienced no hardships. They had suffered from nothing except the reflection of the sun's rays upon the snow, which could easily give them snow blindness. At any other time they would have traveled by night to avoid this inconvenience, but then there was no night. The snow was fortunately melting away, and it was much less brilliant when it was about turning into water. June 28th the temperature arose to 45 degrees. This was accompanied with heavy rain, which the travelers endured stoically, even with pleasure, for it hastened the disappearance of the snow. They had to put on their deerskin moccasins, and change the runners of the sledge. Their journey was delayed, but still they were advancing without any serious obstacles. At times the doctor would pick up rounded or flat stones like pebbles worn smooth by the waves, and then he thought he was near the polar sea, but yet the plain stretched on out of sight. There was no trace of man, no hut, no ken, nor Eskimo's snow house. They were evidently the first to set foot in this new land. The Greenlanders never had gone so far, and yet this country offered plenty of game for the support of that half-starved people. Sometimes bears appeared in the distance, but they showed no signs of attacking. Afar off were herds of muskoxen and reindeer. The doctor would have liked to catch some of the latter to harness to the sledge, but they were timid and not to be caught alive. The 29th, Bell shot a fox, and Altamorn was lucky enough to bring down a medium-sized musk ox, after giving his companions a high idea of his bravery and skill. He was indeed a remarkable hunter, and so much admired by the doctor. The ox was cut out and gave plenty of excellent meat. These lucky supplies were always well received. The least greedy could not restrain their joy at the sight of the meat. The doctor laughed at himself when he caught himself admiring these huge joints. "Let us not be afraid to eat it," he used to say. "A good dinner is a good thing in these expeditions." "Especially," said Johnson, "when it depends on a better or worse shot." "You are right, Johnson," replied the doctor. "One thinks less of one's food when one gets a regular supply from the kitchen." The 30th, the country became unexpectedly rugged, as if it had been upheaved by some volcanic commotion. The cones and peaks increased indefinitely in number and were very high. A southeast breeze began to blow with violence and soon became a real hurricane. It rushed across the snow-covered rocks, among the ice mountains, which, although on the firm land, took the form of hummocks and icebergs. Their presence on these lofty plateaus could not be explained even by the doctor, who had an explanation for almost everything. Warm, damp weather succeeded the tempest. It was a genuine thaw. On all sides resounded the cracking of the ice amid the roar of the avalanches. The travelers carefully avoided the base of these hills. They even took care not to talk aloud, for the sound of the voice could shake the air and cause accident. They were witnesses of frequent and terrible avalanches which they could not have foreseen. In fact, the main peculiarity of polar avalanches is their terrible swiftness. Therein they differ from those of Switzerland and Norway, where they form a ball of small size at first, and then, by adding to themselves the snow and rocks in its passage, it falls with increasing swiftness, destroys forests and villages, but taking an appreciable time in its course. Now, it is otherwise in the countries where Arctic cold rages. The fall of the block of ice is unexpected and startling. Its fall is almost instantaneous, and anyone who saw it from beneath would be certainly crushed by it. The cannonball is not swifter, nor lightning quicker. It starts, falls, and crashes down in a single moment with the dreadful roar of thunder, and with dull echoes. So the amazed spectators see wonderful changes in the appearance of the country. The mountain becomes a plain under the action of a sudden thaw. When the rain has filtered into the fissures of the great blocks and freezes in a single night, it breaks everything by its irresistible expansion, which is more powerful in forming ice than in forming vapor. The phenomenon takes place with terrible swiftness. No catastrophe, fortunately, threatened the sledge and its drivers. The proper precautions were taken, and every danger avoided. Besides, this rugged, icy country was not of great extent, and 3 days later, July 3d, the travelers were on smoother ground. But their eyes were surprised by a new phenomenon, which has for a long time claimed the attention of the scientific men of the two worlds. It was this: the party followed a line of hills not more than 50 feet high, which appeared to run on several miles, and their eastern side was covered with red snow. The surprise and even the sort of alarm which the sight of this crimson curtain gave them may be easily imagined. The doctor hastened, if not to reassure, at least to instruct, his companions. He was familiar with this red snow and the chemical analysis made of it by Wollaston, Candle, Bauer. He told them this red snow was not found in the Arctic regions alone, but in Switzerland in the middle of the Alps. De Saussure collected a large quantity on the Breven in 1760, and since then Captains Ross, Sabine, and others had brought some back from their Arctic journeys. Altamont asked the doctor about the nature of this extraordinary substance. He was told that its color came simply from the presence of organic corpuscles. For a long time it was a question whether these corpuscles were animal or vegetable, but it was soon ascertained that they belonged to the family of microscopic mushrooms, of the genus Uredo, which Bauer proposed naming Uredo vivalis. Then the doctor, prying into the snow with his cane, showed his companions that the scarlet layer was only 9 feet deep, and he bade them calculate how many of these mushrooms there might be on a space of many miles, when scientific men estimated 43,000 in a square centimeter. This coloring probably ran back to a remote period, for the mushrooms were not decomposed by either evaporation or the melting of the snow, nor was their color altered. The phenomenon, although explained, was no less strange. Red is a rare color in nature. The reflection of the sun's rays on this crimson surface produced strange effects. It gave the surrounding objects, men and animals, a brilliant appearance, as if they were lighted by an inward flame, and when the snow was melting, streams of blood seemed to be flowing beneath the travelers' feet. The doctor, who had not been able to examine this substance when he saw it on Crimson Cliffs from Baffin's Bay, here examined it at his ease, and gathered several bottlefuls of it. This red ground, that field of blood, as he called it, took 3 hours' walk to pass over, and then the country resumed its habitual appearance. Chapter 20. Footprints on the snow. July 4th, a dense fog prevailed. They were only able with the greatest difficulty to keep a straight path. They had to consult the compass every moment. Fortunately, there was no accident in the darkness, except that Bell lost his snowshoes, which were broken against a projecting rock. "Well, really," said Johnson, "I thought, after seeing the Mersey and the Thames, that I knew all about fogs, but I see I was mistaken." "We ought," answered Bell, "to light torches as is done at London and Liverpool." "Why not?" asked the doctor. "That's a good idea. It wouldn't light up the road much, but we could see the guide, and follow him more easily." "But what shall we do for torches?" "By lighting tow dipped in alcohol, and fastening to the end of walking sticks." "Good," said Johnson, "and we shall soon have it ready." A quarter of an hour later the little band was walking along with torches faintly lighting up the general gloom. But if they went straighter, they did not go quicker, and the fog lasted till July 6th, the earth being cold then. A blast of north wind carried away all the mist as if it had been rags. Soon the doctor took an observation, and ascertained that meanwhile they had not made 8 miles a day. The 6th, they made an effort to make up for lost time, and they set out early. Altamont and Bell were ahead, choosing the way and looking out for game. Duke was with them. The weather, with its surprising fickleness, had become very clear and dry, and although the guides were 2 miles from the sledge, the doctor did not miss one of their movements. He was consequently very much startled to see them stop suddenly and remain in a position of surprise. They seemed to be gazing into the distance, as if scanning the horizon. Then they bent down to the ground and seemed to be examining it closely, and they arose in evident amazement. Bell seemed to wish to push on, but Altamont held him back. "What can they be doing?" asked the doctor of Johnson. "I know no more than you, doctor. I don't understand their gestures." "They have found the track of some animals," answered Hatteras. "That's not it," said the doctor. "Why not?" "Because Duke would bark." "Still, they've seen marks of some sort." "Let us go on," said Hatteras. "We shall soon know." Johnson urged on the dogs, who quickened their pace. In 20 minutes the five were together, and Hatteras, the doctor, and Johnson were as much surprised as Bell and Altamont. There were in the snow indubitable traces of men, as fresh as if they had just been made. "They are Eskimos," said Hatteras. "Yes," said the doctor, "there is no doubt of that." "You think so?" said Altamont. "Without any doubt." "Well, and this mark," continued Altamont, pointing to another print, which was often repeated. "That one. Do you think it was made by an Eskimo?" The doctor examined it carefully, and was stupefied. The print of a European shoe, with nails, sole, and heel, was clearly stamped in the snow. There could be no further doubt. A man, a stranger, had been there. "Europeans here!" cried Hatteras. "Evidently," said Johnson. "And still," said the doctor, "it is so unlikely that we ought to look twice before being sure." Thereupon he looked twice, 3 times, at the print, and he was obliged to acknowledge its extraordinary origin. Defoe's hero was not more amazed when he saw the footprint on the sand of his island, but if he was afraid, Hatteras was simply angry. An European so near the pole! They pushed on to examine the footprints. For a quarter of a mile they were continually repeated, mingled with marks of moccasins. Then they turned to the west. When they had reached this point they consulted as to whether they should follow them any farther. "No," said Hatteras. "Let us go on." He was interrupted by an exclamation of the doctor, who had just picked up on the snow an object even more convincing, and of the origin of which there could be no doubt. It was the object glass of a pocket telescope. "Now," he said, "we can't doubt that there is a stranger here." "Forward!" cried Hatteras. He uttered this word so sharply that each one obeyed, and the sledge resumed its monotonous progress. They all scanned the horizon attentively, except Hatteras, who was filled with wrath and did not care to see anything. Still, since they ran the risk of coming across a band of travelers, they had to take precautions. It was very disappointing to see anyone ahead of them on the route. The doctor, although not as angry as Hatteras, was somewhat vexed, in spite of his usual philosophy. Altamont seemed equally annoyed. Johnson and Bell muttered threatening words between their teeth. "Come," said the doctor, "let us take heart against our bad fortune." "We must confess," said Johnson, without being heard by Altamont, "that if we find the place taken, it would disgust us with journeying to the pole." "And yet," answered Bell, "there is no possibility of doubting." "No," retorted the doctor, "I turn it all over in vain, and say it is improbable, impossible. I have to give it up. This shoe was not pressed into the snow without being at the end of a leg, and without the leg being attached to a human body. I could forgive Eskimos, but a European—" "The fact is," answered Johnson, "that if we are going to find all the rooms taken in the hotel of the end of the world, it would be annoying." "Very annoying," said Altamont. "Well, we shall see," said the doctor. And they pushed on. The day ended without any new fact to indicate the presence of strangers in this part of New America, and they at last encamped for the evening. A rather strong wind from the south had sprung up and obliged them to seek a secure shelter for their tent in the bottom of a ravine. The sky was threatening. Long clouds passed rapidly through the air. They passed near the ground, and so quickly that the eye could hardly follow them. At times some of the mist touched the ground, and the tent resisted with difficulty the violence of the hurricane. "It's going to be a nasty night," said Johnson, after supper. "It won't be cold, but stormy," answered the doctor. "Let us take precautions, and make the tent firm with large stones." "You are right, Doctor. If the wind should carry away the canvas, heaven alone knows where we should find it again." Hence they took every precaution against such a danger, and the wearied travellers lay down to sleep. But they found it impossible. The tempest was loose, and hastened northward with incomparable violence. The clouds were whirling about like steam which has just escaped from a boiler. The last avalanches, under the force of the hurricane, fell into the ravines, and their dull echoes were distinctly heard. The air seemed to be struggling with the water, and fire alone was absent from this contest of the elements. Amid the general tumult there is distinguished separate sounds, not the crash of heavy falling bodies, but the distinct cracking of bodies breaking. A clear snap was frequently heard, like breaking steel, amid the roar of the tempest. These last sounds were evidently avalanches torn off by the gusts, but the doctor could not explain the others. In the few moments of anxious silence, when the hurricane seemed to be taking breath in order to blow with greater violence, the travellers exchanged their suppositions. "There is a sound of crashing," said the doctor, "as if icebergs and ice fields were being blown against one another." "Yes," answered Altamont, "one would say the whole crust of the globe was falling in." "Say, did you hear that?" "If we were near the sea," the doctor went on, "I should think it was ice breaking." "In fact," said Johnson, "there is no other explanation possible." "Can we have reached the coast?" asked Hatteras. "It's not impossible," answered the doctor. "Hold on," he said, after a very distinct sound. "Shouldn't you say that was the crashing of ice? We may be very near the ocean." "If it is," continued Hatteras, "I should not be afraid to go across the ice fields." "Oh," said the doctor, "they must be broken by such a tempest." "We shall see tomorrow. However that may be, if any men have to travel in such a night as this, I pity them." The hurricane raged 10 hours without cessation, and no one of those in the tent had a moment's sleep. The night passed in profound uneasiness. In fact, under such circumstances, every new incident, a tempest, an avalanche, might bring serious consequences. The doctor would gladly have gone out to reconnoiter, but how could he with such a wind raging? Fortunately, the hurricane grew less violent early the next day. They could leave the tent which had resisted so sturdily. The doctor, Hatteras, and Johnson went to a hill about 300 feet high, which they ascended without difficulty. Their eyes beheld an entirely altered country, composed of bare rocks, sharp ridges entirely clear of ice. It was summer succeeding winter, which had been driven away by the tempest. The snow had been blown away by the wind before it could melt, and the barren soil reappeared. But Hatteras's glances were all turned towards the north, where the horizon appeared to be hidden by dark mist. "That may be the effect of the ocean," said the doctor. "You are right," said Hatteras, "the sea must be there." "That's what we call the blink of the water," said Johnson. "Exactly," said the doctor. "Well, let us start," said Hatteras, "and push on to this new ocean." "That rejoices my heart," said Clawbonny to the captain. "Certainly," was the enthusiastic answer. "Soon we shall have reached the pole." "And doesn't the prospect delight you, too, Doctor?" "It does. I am always happy, and especially about the happiness of others." The three Englishmen returned to the ravine, the sledge was made ready, and they left the camp and resumed their march. Each one dreaded finding new tracks, but all the rest of the way they saw no trace of any human being. 3 hours later they reached the coast. "The sea! The sea!" they all shouted. "And the open sea!" cried the captain. It was 10 o'clock in the morning. In fact, the hurricane had cleared up the polar basin. The shattered ice was floating away in every direction. The largest pieces, forming icebergs, had just weighed anchor and were sailing on the open sea. The wind had made a harsh attack upon the field. Fragments of ice covered the surrounding rocks. The little which was left of the ice field seemed very soft. On the rocks were large pieces of seaweed. The ocean stretched beyond the line of vision, with no island or new land peering above the horizon. In the east and west were two capes gently sloping to the water. At their end the sea was breaking, and the wind was carrying a slight foam. The land of New America thus died away in the polar ocean, quietly and gently. It rounded into an open bay, with roadstead enclosed by the two promontories. In the middle a rock made a little natural harbor, sheltered against 3 points of the compass. It ran back into the land in the broad bed of a stream, through which ran down the melted snows of winter, now forming a perfect torrent. Hatteras, after noticing the outline of the coast, resolved to make the preparations for departure that very day, to launch the boat, to put the unloaded sledge on board for future excursions. That took all day, then the tent was raised, and after a comfortable meal work began. Meanwhile the doctor took out his instruments to take an observation and determine the position of a part of the bay. Hatteras hurried on the work. He was anxious to start. He wanted to leave the land, and to be in advance in case any others should reach the sea. At 5 o'clock in the evening Johnson and Bell had nothing to do but to fold their arms. The launch was rocking gently in her little harbor, with her mast set, her jib lowered, and her foresail in the brails. The provisions and most of the things on the sledge had been put on board. Only the tent and a little of the camping material remained to be put on board the next day. The doctor found all these preparations complete on his return. When he saw the launch quietly sheltered from the wind, it occurred to him to give a name to the little harbor, and he proposed that of Altamont. This proposition was unanimously agreed to. So it was named Altamont Harbor. According to the doctor's calculations, it lay in latitude 87 degrees and 5 minutes, and longitude 118 degrees and 35 minutes E of Greenwich, that is to say, less than 3 degrees from the pole. The band had gone more than 200 miles from Victoria Bay to Altamont Harbor. Chapter 21. The Open Sea. The next morning Johnson and Bell set about carrying on board the camping material. At 8 o'clock all the preparations for departure were complete. At the moment of starting the doctor's thoughts returned to the footprints they had seen. Were these men trying to gain the north? Had they any means of crossing the polar sea? Should they meet them again? For 3 days they had come across no trace of the travellers, and certainly, whoever they were, they could not have reached Altamont Harbor. That was a place which they were the first to set foot in. But the doctor, who was harassed by his thoughts, wanted to take a last view of the country, and he ascended a little hill about 100 feet high, whence he had a distant view to the south. When he had reached the top, he put his glass to his eyes. Great was his surprise when he found he could not see anything, either at a distance on the plains, or within a few feet of him. This seemed very odd. He made another examination, and at last he looked at the glass. The object glass was missing. "The object glass," he cried. The sudden revelation may be imagined. He uttered a cry so loud as to be heard by his companions, and they were much astonished at seeing him running down the hill. "Well, what's the matter now?" asked Johnson. The doctor was out of breath and unable to speak. At length he managed to bring out the footprints. "The expedition." "Well, what," said Hatteras, "are they here?" "No, no," resumed the doctor, "the object glass, mine." And he showed his own glass. "Oh, ho," cried the American, "so you lost?" "Yes." "But then the footprints?" "Our own," cried the doctor. "We lost our way in the fog. We went around in a circle and came across our own footprints." "But the print of the shoes?" asked Hatteras. "Bell's, you know, who walked all day in the snow after breaking his snowshoes." "That's true," said Bell. Their mistake was so clear that they all, except Hatteras, burst out laughing, and he was none the less pleased at the discovery. "We were stupid enough," said the doctor when they had stopped laughing. "What good guesses we made! Strangers up here! Really, we ought to think before speaking. Well, since we are easy on this point, we can't do better than start." "Forward," said Hatteras. A quarter of an hour later each one had taken his place on board of the launch, which sailed out of Altamont Harbor under mainsail and jib. This voyage began Wednesday, July 10th. They were then very near the pole, exactly 175 miles from it. However small the land might be at that point of the globe, the voyage would certainly be a short one. The wind was light, but fair. The thermometer stood at 50 degrees, it was really warm. The launch had not been injured by the journey on the sledge, it was in perfect order, and sailed easily. Johnson was at the helm, the doctor, Bell, and Altamont were lying as best they might among the load, partly on deck, partly below. Hatteras stood forward, with his eyes turned to the mysterious point, which attracted him with an irresistible power, as the magnetic pole attracts the needle. If there should be any land, he wanted to be the first to see it. This honor really belonged to him. He noticed, besides, that the surface of the polar sea was covered with short waves, like those of land-locked seas. This he considered a proof of the nearness of the opposite shore, and the doctor shared his opinion. Hatteras's desire to find land at the North Pole is perfectly comprehensible. His disappointment would have been great if the uncertain sea covered the place where he wanted to find a piece of land, no matter how small. In fact, how could he give a special name to an uncertain portion of the sea? How plant the flag of his country among the waves? How take possession, in the name of Her Gracious Majesty, of the liquid element? So Hatteras, compass in hand, gazed steadily at the north. There was nothing that he could see between him and the horizon, where the line of the blue water met the blue sky. A few floating icebergs seemed to be leaving the way free for these bold sailors. The appearance of this region was singularly strange. Was this impression simply the result of the nervous excitement of the travelers? It is hard to say. Still, the doctor in his journal has described the singular appearance of the ocean. He spoke of it as Penny did, according to whom these countries present an appearance offering the most striking contrast of a sea filled with millions of living creatures. The sea, with its various colors, appeared strangely transparent and endowed with a wonderful dispersive quality, as if it had been made with carburet of sulfur. This clearness let them see down into immeasurable depths. It seemed as if the sea were lit up like a large aquarium. Probably some electric phenomenon at the bottom of the sea lit it up. So the launch seemed hung in a bottomless abyss. On the surface of the water the birds were flying in large flocks, like thick clouds big with a storm. Aquatic birds of all sorts were there, from the albatross, which is common to the south, to the penguin of the Arctic seas, but of enormous size. Their cries were deafening. In considering them, the doctor found his knowledge of natural history too scanty. Many of the names escaped him, and he found himself bowing his head when their wings beat the air. Some of these large birds measured 20 feet from tip to tip. They covered the whole launch with their expanded wings, and there were legions of these birds, of which the names had never appeared in the London Index Ornithologus. The doctor was dejected and stupefied at finding his science so faulty. Then, when his glance fell from the wonders of the air to the calm surface of the ocean, he saw no less astonishing productions of the animal kingdom. Among others, medusae 30 feet broad. They served as food for the other fish, and they floated like islands amid the seaweed. What a difference from the microscopic medusae observed in the seas of Greenland by Scoresby, and of which that explorer estimated the number at 23,898 billions of millions in a space of 2 square miles. Then the eye glancing down into the transparent water, the sight was equally strange, so full was it of fishes. Sometimes the animals were swimming about below, and the eye saw them gradually disappearing, and fading away like spectres. Then they would leave the lower layers and rise to the surface. The monsters seemed in no way alarmed at the presence of the launch. They even passed near it, rubbing their fins against it. This, which would have alarmed whalers, did not disturb these men, and yet the sea monsters were very large. Young sea calves played about them. The swordfish, with its long, narrow, conical sword with which it cleaves the ice, was chasing the more timid cetacea. Numberless spouting whales were clearly to be heard. The sword caper, with its delicate tail and large caudal fins, swam with incomprehensible quickness, feeding on smaller animals, such as the cod, as swift as itself, while the white whale, which is more inactive, swallowed peacefully the tranquil, lazy mollusks. Farther down were Greenland animacs, long and dark, huge sperm whales, swimming in the midst of ambergris, in which took place Tom Eric battles that reddened the ocean for many miles around, the great Labrador tegusic. Sharp-backed dolphins, the whole family of seals and walruses, sea dogs, horses and bears, lions and elephants, seemed to be feeding on the rich pastures, and the doctor admired the numberless animals, as he would have done the crustacea in the crystal basins of the zoological garden. What beauty, variety, and power in nature! How strange and wonderful everything seemed in the polar regions! The air acquired an unnatural purity. One would have said it was full of oxygen. The explorers breathed with delight this air, which filled them with fresher life, without taking account of the result. They were, so to speak, exposed to a real consuming fire, of which one can give no idea, not even a feeble one. Their emotions, their breathing and digestion, were endowed with superhuman energy, their ideas became more excited, they lived a whole day in an hour. Through all these wonders the launch pushed on before a moderate breeze, occasionally feeling the air moved by the albatross's wings. Towards evening, the coast of New America disappeared beneath the horizon. In the temperate zones, as well as at the equator, night falls, but here the sun simply described a circle parallel to the line of the horizon. The launch, bathed in its oblique rays, could not lose sight of it. The animate beings of these regions seemed to know the approach of evening as truly as if the sun had set. Birds, fish, cetacea, all disappeared. Whither? To the depths of the ocean? Who could say? But soon total silence succeeded to their cries, and the sound of their passage through the water. The sea grew calmer, and night retained its gentle peace even beneath the glowing sun. Since leaving Altamont Harbour the launch had made 1 degree to the north. The next day nothing appeared on the horizon, neither projecting peaks nor those vague signs by which sailors detect their nearness to land. The wind was good, but not strong, the sea not high, the birds and fish came as thick as the day before. The doctor, leaning over the gunwale, could see the cetacea rising slowly to the surface. A few icebergs and scattered pieces of ice alone broke the monotony of the ocean. But the ice grew rarer, and was not enough to interfere with the boat. It is to be remembered that the launch was then 10 degrees above the pole of cold, and as to the parallels of temperature, they might as well have been 10 degrees to the other side. There was nothing surprising in the sea being open at this epoch, as it must have been at Disco Island in Baffin's Bay. So a sailing vessel would have plenty of sailing room in the summer months. This observation had a great practical importance. In fact, if whalers can ever get to the polar basin, either by the seas of North America or those of the north of Asia, they are sure of getting full cargoes, for this part of the ocean seems to be the universal fishing pond, the general reservoir of whales, seals, and all marine animals. At noon the line of the horizon was still unbroken. The doctor began to doubt of the existence of a continent in so high latitudes. Still, as he reflected, he was compelled to believe in the existence of an Arctic continent. In fact, at the creation of the world, after the cooling of the terrestrial crust, the waters formed by the condensation of the atmospheric vapor were compelled to obey the centrifugal force, to fly to the equator and leave the motionless extremities of the globe. Hence the necessary immersion of the countries near the pole. The doctor considered this reasoning very just. And so it seemed to Hatteras. Hence the captain still tried to pierce the mists of the horizon. His glass never left his eyes. In the color of the water, the shape of the waves, the direction of the wind, he tried to find traces of neighboring land. His head was bent forward, and even one who did not know his thoughts would have admired, so full was his attitude of energetic desire and anxious interrogation. Chapter 22. The approach to the pole. The time flew by in this uncertainty. Nothing appeared on the sharply defined circle of the sea, nothing was to be seen save sky and sea, not one of those floating land plants which rejoiced the heart of Christopher Columbus as he was about to discover America. Hatteras was still gazing. At length, at about 6 o'clock in the evening, a shapeless vapor appeared at a little height above the level of the sea. It looked like a puff of smoke. The sky was perfectly cold, so this vapor was no cloud. It would keep appearing and disappearing, as if it were in commotion. Hatteras was the first to detect this phenomenon. He examined it with his glass for a whole hour. Suddenly, some sure sign apparently occurred to him, for he stretched out his arms to the horizon and cried in a loud voice, "Land, ho!" At these words each one sprang to his feet as if moved by electricity. A sort of smoke was clearly rising above the sea. "I see it," cried the doctor. "Yes." "Certainly." "Yes," said Johnson. "It's a cloud," said Altamont. "It's land," answered Hatteras, as if perfectly convinced. But, as often happens with objects that are indistinct in the distance, the point they had been looking at seemed to have disappeared. At length they found it again, and the doctor even fancied that he could see a swift light 20 or 25 miles to the north. "It's a volcano," he cried. "A volcano," said Altamont. "Without doubt." "At this high latitude?" And why not, continued the doctor, isn't Iceland a volcanic land, so to speak, made of volcanoes? Yes, Iceland, said the American, but so near the pole. Well, didn't Commodore James Ross find in the southern continent two active volcanoes, Erebus and Terror by name, in longitude 170 degrees and latitude 78 degrees? Why then shouldn't there be volcanoes at the North Pole? It may be so, after all, answered Altamont. Ah, cried the doctor, I see it clearly. It is a volcano. Well, said Hatteras, let us sail straight towards it. The wind is changing, said Johnson. Haul on the foresheet and bring her nearer the wind. But this maneuver only turned the launch away from the point they had been gazing at, and even with their closest examination they could not find it again. Still, they could not doubt that they were nearing land. They had seen, if they had not reached, the object of their voyage, and within 24 hours they would set foot on this unknown shore. Providence, after letting them get so near, would not drive them back at the last moment. Still, no one manifested the joy which might have been expected under the circumstances. Each one wondered in silence what this polar land might be. The animals seemed to shun it. At evening the birds, instead of seeking refuge there, flew with all speed to the south. Could not a single gull or ptarmigan find a resting place there? Even the fish, the large cetacea, avoided that coast. Whence came this repugnance, which was shared by all the animals they saw, unless from terror? The sailors experienced the same feeling. They gave way to the feelings inspired by the situation, and gradually each one felt his eyelids grow heavy. It was Hatteras's watch. He took the tiller. The doctor, Altamont, Johnson, and Bell fell asleep, stretched on the benches, and soon were dreaming soundly. Hatteras struggled against his sleepiness. He wished to lose not a moment, but the gentle motion of the launch rocked him, in spite of himself, into a gentle sleep. The boat made hardly any headway. The wind did not keep her sails full. Far off in the west a few icebergs were reflecting the sun's rays, and glowing brightly in the midst of the ocean. Hatteras began to dream. He recalled his whole life. With the incalculable speed of dreams, he went through the winter again, the scenes at Victoria Bay, Fort Providence, Doctor's House, the finding the American beneath the snow. Here remoter incidents came up before him. He dreamed of the burning of the Forward, of his treacherous companions who had abandoned him. What had become of them? He thought of Shandon, Wall, and the brutal Pen. Where were they now? Had they succeeded in reaching Baffin's Bay across the ice? Then he went further back, to his departure from England, to his previous voyages, his failures and misfortunes. Then he forgot his present situation, his success so near at hand, his hopes half realized. His dreams carried him from joy to agony. So it went on for 2 hours, then his thoughts changed. He began to think of the pole, and he saw himself at last setting foot on this English continent and unfolding the flag of the United Kingdom. While he was dozing in this way, a huge, dark cloud was climbing across the sky, throwing a deep shadow over the sea. It is difficult to imagine the great speed with which hurricanes arise in the Arctic seas. The vapors which rise under the equator are condensed above the great glacier of the north, and large masses of air are needed to take their place. This can explain the severity of Arctic storms. At the first shock of the wind, the captain and his friends awoke from their sleep, ready to manage the launch. The waves were high and steep. The launch tossed helplessly about, now plunged into deep abysses, now oscillated on the pointed crest of a wave, inclining often at an angle of more than 45 degrees. Hatteras took firm hold of the tiller, which was noisily sliding from one side to the other. Every now and then some strong wave would strike it and nearly throw him over. Johnson and Bell were busily occupied in bailing out the water which the launch would occasionally ship. "This is a storm we hardly expected," said Altamont, holding fast to his bench. "We ought to expect anything here," answered the doctor. These remarks were made amid the roar of the tempest and the hissing of the waves, which the violence of the wind reduced to a fine spray. It was nearly impossible for one to hear his neighbor. It was hard to keep the boat's head to the north. The clouds hid everything a few fathoms from the boat, and they had no mark to sail by. This sudden tempest, just as they were about attaining their object, seemed full of warning. To their excited minds it came like an order to go no farther. Did nature forbid approach to the pole? Was this point of the globe surrounded by hurricanes and tempests which rendered access impossible? But anyone who had caught sight of those men could have seen that they did not flinch before wind or wave, and that they would push on to the end. So they struggled on all day, braving death at every instant, and making no progress northward, but also losing no ground. They were wet through by the rain and waves. Above the din of the storm they could hear the hoarse cries of the birds. But at 6 o'clock in the evening, while the waves were rising, there came a sudden calm. The wind stopped as if by a miracle. The sea was smooth, as if it had not felt a puff of wind for 12 hours. The hurricane seemed to have respected this part of the polar ocean. What was the reason? It was an extraordinary phenomenon, which Captain Sabine had witnessed in his voyages in Greenland seas. The fog, without lifting, was very bright. The launch drifted along in a zone of electric light, an immense St. Elmo fire, brilliant but without heat. The mast, sail, and rigging stood out black against the phosphorescent air. The men seemed to have plunged into a bath of transparent rays, and their faces were all lit up. The sudden calm of this portion of the ocean came, without doubt, from the ascending motion of the columns of air, while the tempest, which was a cyclone, turned rapidly about this peaceful center. But this atmosphere on fire suggested a thought to Hatteras. "The volcano," he cried. "Is it possible?" asked Bell. "No, no," answered the doctor, "we should be smothered if the flames were to reach us." "Perhaps it is its reflection in the fog," said Altamont. "No. We should have to admit that we were near land, and in that case we should hear the eruption." "But then?" asked the captain. "It is a phenomenon," said the doctor, "which has been seldom observed hitherto. If we go on we cannot help leaving this luminous sphere and re-entering storm and darkness." "Whatever it is, push on," said Hatteras. "Forward," cried his companions, who did not wish to delay even for breathing time in this quiet spot. The bright sail hung down the glistening mast, the oars dipped into the glowing waves, and appeared to drip with sparks. Hatteras, compass in hand, turned the boat's head to the north. Gradually the mist lost its brightness and transparency, the wind could be heard roaring a short distance off, and soon the launch, lying over before a strong gust, re-entered the zone of storms. Fortunately, the hurricane had shifted a point towards the south, and the launch was able to run before the wind, straight for the pole, running the risk of foundering, but sailing very fast. A rock, reef, or piece of ice might at any moment rise before them, and crush them to atoms. Still, no one of these men raised a single objection, nor suggested prudence. They were seized with the madness of danger. Thirst for the unknown took possession of them. They were going along, not blinded, but blindly, finding their speed only too slow for their impatience. Hatteras held the tiller firm amid the waves lashed into foam by the tempest. Still the proximity of land became evident. Strange signs filled the air. Suddenly the mist parted like a curtain torn by the wind, and for a moment, brief as a flash of lightning, a great burst of flame could be seen rising towards the sky. "The volcano!" "The volcano!" was the cry which escaped from the lips of all, but the strange vision disappeared at once. The wind shifted to the southeast, took the launch on her quarter, and drove her from this unapproachable land. "Malediction," said Hatteras, shifting her sail, "we were not 3 miles from land." Hatteras could not resist the force of the tempest, but without yielding to it, he brought the boat about in the wind, which was blowing with fearful violence. Every now and then the launch leaned to one side, so that almost her whole keel was exposed. Still she obeyed her rudder, and rose like a stumbling horse which his rider brings up by spur and reins. Hatteras, with his hair flying and his hand on the tiller, seemed to be part of the boat, like horse and man at the time of the centaurs. Suddenly a terrible sight presented itself to their eyes. Within less than 10 fathoms a floe was balancing on the waves. It fell and rose like the launch, threatening in its fall to crush it to atoms. But to this danger of being plunged into the abyss was added another no less terrible, for this drifting floe was covered with white bears, crowded together and wild with terror. "Bears! Bears!" cried Bell, in terror. And each one gazed with terror. The floe pitched fearfully, sometimes at such an angle that the bears were all rolled together. Then their roars were almost as loud as the tempest. A formidable din arose from the floating menagerie. If the floe had upset, the bears would have swum to the boat and clambered aboard. For a quarter of an hour, which was as long as a century, the launch and floe drifted along in consort, 20 fathoms from one another at one moment and nearly running together the next, and at times they were so near to one another, the bears need only have dropped to have got on board. The Greenland dogs trembled from terror. Duke remained motionless. Hatteras and his companions were silent. It did not occur to them to put the helm down and sail away, and they went straight on. A vague feeling of astonishment rather than terror took possession of them. They admired this spectacle which completed the struggle of the elements. Finally the floe drifted away, borne by the wind, which the launch was able to withstand, as she lay with her head to the wind, and it disappeared in the mist, its presence being known merely by the distant roaring of the bears. At that moment the fury of the tempest redoubled. There was an endless unchaining of atmospheric waves. The boat, borne by the waves, was tossed about giddily. Her sail flew away like a huge white bird. A whirlpool, a new maelstrom, formed among the waves. The boat was carried so fast that it seemed to the men as if the rapidly revolving water were motionless. They were gradually sinking down. There was an irresistible power dragging them down and engulfing them alive. All 5 arose. They looked at one another with terror. They grew dizzy. They felt an undefinable dread of the abyss. But suddenly the launch arose perpendicularly. Her prow was higher than the whirling waves. The speed with which she was moving hurled her beyond the center of attraction, and escaping by the tangent of this circumference which was making more than 1,000 turns a second, she was hurled away with the rapidity of a cannonball. Altamont, the doctor, Johnson, and Bell were thrown down among the seats. When they rose, Hatteras had disappeared. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. Chapter 23. The English Flag. One cry, bursting from the lips of the other 4, succeeded their first stupefaction. "Hatteras!" cried the doctor. "Gone," said Johnson and Bell. "Lost!" They looked about, but nothing was to be seen on the storm-tossed sea. Duke barked despairingly. He tried to spring into the water, but Bell managed to hold him. "Take a place at the helm, Altamont," said the doctor. "Let us try everything to save the captain." Johnson and Bell took their seats. Altamont took the helm, and the launch came into wind again. Johnson and Bell began to row vigorously. For an hour they remained at the scene of the accident. They sought earnestly, but in vain. The unfortunate Hatteras was lost in the storm. Lost, so near the pole, so near the end, of which he had had but a glimpse. The doctor called aloud, and fired the guns. Duke added his howling, but there was no answer. Then profound grief seized Clawbonny. His head sank into his hands, and his companion saw that he was weeping. In fact, at this distance from land, with a scrap of wood to hold him up, Hatteras could not reach the shore alive, and if anything did come ashore, it would be his disfigured corpse. After hunting for an hour, they decided to turn to the north and struggle against the last furies of the tempest. At 5 o'clock in the morning of July 11th the wind went down, the sea grew quieter. The sky regained its polar clearness, and within 3 miles of them appeared the land. This continent was but an island, or rather a volcano, peering up like a lighthouse at the North Pole. The mountain, in full eruption, was hurling forth a mass of burning stones and melting rocks. It seemed to be rising and falling beneath the successive blasts as if it were breathing. The things which were cast out reached a great height in the air amid the jets of flame. Torrents of lava were flowing down the side of the mountain. Here creeping between steaming rocks, there falling in cascades amid the purple vapor, and lower down 1,000 streams united in one large river which ran boiling into the sea. The volcano seemed to have but a single crater, whence arose a column of fire, lighted by transverse rays. One would have said that part of the magnificence of the phenomenon was due to electricity. Above the flames floated an immense cloud of smoke, red below, black above. It rose with great majesty, and unrolled into huge layers. The sky at a considerable height had an ashy hue. The darkness, which was so marked during the tempest, and of which the doctor could give no satisfactory explanation, evidently came from the ashes, which completely hid the sun. He remembered a similar fact that took place in 1812 at the Barbados, which at noon was plunged into total darkness by the mass of cinders thrown from the crater of Isle St. Vincent. This enormous volcano, jutting up in mid-ocean, was about 6,000 feet high, very nearly the altitude of Hecla. A line from the summit to the base would form with the horizon an angle of about 11 degrees. It seemed to rise from the bosom of the waves as the launch approached it. There was no trace of vegetation. There was no shore, it ran down steep to the sea. "Shall we be able to land?" said the doctor. "The wind is carrying us there," answered Altamont. "But I can't see any beach on which we could set foot." "So it seems from here," answered Johnson, "but we shall find some place for our boat, that is all we need." "Let us go on, then," answered Clawbonny, sadly. The doctor had no eyes for the strange continent which was rising before him. The land of the pole was there, but not the man who had discovered it. 500 feet from the rocks the sea was boiling under the action of subterraneous fires. The island was from 8 to 10 miles in circumference, no more, and, according to their calculation, it was very near the pole, if indeed the axis of the world did not pass exactly through it. As they drew near they noticed a little fjord large enough to shelter their boat. They sailed towards it, filled with the fear of finding the captain's body cast ashore by the tempest. Still, it seemed unlikely that any corpse should rest there. There was no beach, and the sea beat against the steep rocks. Thick ashes, on which no human foot had ever stepped, covered the ground beyond the reach of the waves. At last the launch slipped between the breakers, and there she was perfectly sheltered against the surf. Then Duke's lamentable howling redoubled. The poor animal called for the captain with his sad wails among the rocks. His barking was vain, and the doctor caressed him, without being able to calm him, when the faithful dog, as if he wanted to replace his master, made a prodigious leap, and was the first to get ashore amid the dust and ashes which flew about him. "Duke! Duke!" said the doctor. Duke did not hear him, but disappeared. The men then went ashore, and made the launch fast. Altamont was preparing to climb up a large pile of rocks, when Duke's distant barking was heard. It expressed pain, not wrath. "Listen," said the doctor. "Has he got on the track of some animal?" asked the boatswain. "No," answered the doctor, quivering with emotion. "He's mourning, crying. Hatteras's body is there." At these words the four men started after Duke. In the midst of blinding cinders, they reached the end of the fjord, a little place 10 feet broad, where the waves were gently breaking. Their Duke was barking near a body wrapped up in the English flag. "Hatteras, Hatteras!" cried the doctor, rushing to the body of his friend. But at once he uttered an explanation which it is impossible to render. This bleeding and apparently lifeless body had just given signs of life. "Alive, alive!" he cried. "Yes," said a feeble voice, "living on the land of the pole, where the tempest cast me up. Living on Queen Island." "Hurrah for England!" cried the 5 together. "And for America," added the doctor, holding out one hand to Hatteras and the other to Altamont. Duke, too, hurrahed in his own way, which was as good as any other. At first these kind-hearted men were wholly given up to the pleasure of seeing their captain again. They felt the tears welling up into their eyes. The doctor examined Hatteras's condition. He was not seriously injured. The wind had carried him to the shore, where it was hard to land. The bold sailor, often beaten back, at last succeeded in clambering upon a rock above the reach of the waves. Then he lost consciousness, after wrapping himself up in his flag, and he only came to himself under Duke's caresses and barking. After receiving a few attentions, Hatteras was able to rise, and, leaning on the doctor's arm, to go to the launch. "The pole, the North Pole," he repeated as he walked along. "You are happy," the doctor said to him. "Yes, happy." "And you, my friend, don't you feel happy at being here? This land is the land of the pole. This sea we have crossed is the sea of the pole. This air we breathe is the air of the pole. Oh, the North Pole, the North Pole." As he spoke, Hatteras was the victim of a violent excitement, a sort of fever, and the doctor in vain tried to calm him. His eyes were strangely bright, and his thoughts were boiling within him. Clawbonny ascribed this condition to the terrible perils he had gone through. Hatteras evidently needed rest, and they set about seeking a place to camp. Altamont soon found a grotto in the rocks, which had fallen in such a way as to form a cavern. Johnson and Bell brought provisions there, and let loose the dogs. Towards 11 o'clock everything was prepared for a meal. The canvas of the tent served as a cloth. The breakfast, consisting of pemmican, salt meat, tea, and coffee, was set and soon devoured. But first, Hatteras demanded that an observation should be made. He wanted to know its position exactly. The doctor and Altamont then took their instruments, and after taking an observation they found the precise position of the grotto to be latitude 89 degrees, 59 minutes and 15 seconds. The longitude at this height was of no importance, for all the meridians run together within a few hundred feet higher. So in reality the island was situated at the North Pole, and the 90th degree of latitude was only 45 seconds from there, exactly 3/4 of a mile, that is to say, towards the top of the volcano. When Hatteras knew this result, he asked that it should be stated in 2 documents, one to be placed in a cairn on the shore. So at once the doctor took his pen and wrote the following document, one copy of which is now in the archives of the Royal Geographical Society in London, July 11, 1861, in north latitude 89 degrees, 59 minutes and 15 seconds, Queen Island was discovered at the North Pole by Captain Hatteras, commanding the brig Forward of Liverpool, who has set his name here too, with his companions. Whoever shall find this document is entreated to forward it to the Admiralty. Signed, John Hatteras, Captain of the Forward. D.R. Clawbonny, Altamont, Captain of the Porpoise, Johnson, Boatswain, Bell, Carpenter. And now, my friends, to table, said the doctor, gaily. Chapter 24. Polar Cosmography. Of course, to eat at table, they were obliged to sit on the ground. But, said Clawbonny, who wouldn't give all the tables and dining rooms in the world to dine in north latitude 89 degrees, 59 minutes and 15 seconds? The thoughts of each one were about their situation. They had no other idea than the North Pole. The dangers they had undergone to reach it, those to overcome before returning, were forgotten in their unprecedented success. What neither Europeans, Americans, nor Asiatics had been able to do, they had accomplished. Hence they were all ready to listen to the doctor when he told them all that his inexhaustible memory could recall about their position. It was with real enthusiasm that he first proposed their captain's health. To John Hatteras, he said. To John Hatteras, repeated the others. To the North Pole, answered the captain, with a warmth that was unusual in this man who was usually so self-restrained, but who now was in a state of great nervous excitement. They touched glasses, and the toasts were followed by earnest handshakings. It is, said the doctor, the most important geographical fact of our day. Who would have thought that this discovery would precede that of the centre of Africa or Australia? Really, Hatteras, you are greater than Livingstone, Burton, and Bath. All honour to you. You are right, doctor, said Altamont. It would seem, from the difficulty of the undertaking, that the pole would be the last place discovered. Whenever the government was absolutely determined to know the middle of Africa, it would have succeeded at the cost of so many men and so much money, but here nothing is less certain than success, and there might be obstacles really insuperable. Insuperable, cried Hatteras with warmth. There are no insuperable obstacles, there are more or less determined minds, that is all. Well, said Johnson, we are here, and it is well. But, doctor, will you tell me, once for all, what there is so remarkable about the pole? It is this, Johnson, that it is the only motionless part of the globe, while all the rest is turning with extreme rapidity. But I don't see that we are more motionless here than at Liverpool. No more than you perceive the motion at Liverpool, and that is because in both cases you participate in the movement or the repose. But the fact is no less certain. The earth rotates in 24 hours, and this motion is on an axis with its extremities at the 2 poles. Well, we are at one of the extremities of the axis, which is necessarily motionless. So, said Bell, when our countrymen are turning rapidly, we are perfectly still. Very nearly, for we are not exactly at the pole. You are right, doctor, said Hatteras seriously, and shaking his head, "We are still 45 seconds from the precise spot." "That is not far," answered Altamont, "and we can consider ourselves motionless." "Yes," continued the doctor, "while those living at the equator move at the rate of 396 leagues an hour." "And without getting tired," said Bell. "Exactly," answered the doctor. "But," continued Johnson, "besides this movement of rotation, doesn't the Earth also move about the Sun?" "Yes, and this takes a year." "Is it swifter than the other?" "Infinitely so, and I ought to say that, although we are at the pole, it takes us with it as well as all the people in the world. So our pretended immobility is a chimera. We are motionless with regard to the other points of the globe, but not so with regard to the Sun." "Good," said Bell, with an accent of comic regret, "so I, who thought I was still, was mistaken. This illusion has to be given up. One can't have a moment's peace in this world." "You are right, Bell," answered Johnson, "and will you tell us, Doctor, how fast this motion is?" "It is very fast," answered the doctor. "The Earth moves around the Sun 76 times faster than a 24-pound cannonball flies, which goes 195 fathoms a second. It moves, then, 7 leagues and 6/10 per second. You see, it is very different from the diurnal movement of the equator." "The deuce," said Bell, "that is incredible, Doctor. More than 7 leagues a second, and that when it would have been so easy to be motionless, if God had wished it." "Good," said Altamont. "Do you think so, Bell? In that case no more night, nor spring, nor autumn, nor winter." "Without considering a still more terrible result," continued the doctor. "What is that?" asked Johnson. "We should all fall into the Sun." "Fall into the Sun," repeated Bell with surprise. "Yes. If this motion were to stop, the Earth would fall into the Sun in 64 days and a half." "A fall of 64 days," said Johnson. "No more nor less," answered the doctor, "for it would have to fall a distance of 38 millions of leagues." "What is the weight of the Earth?" asked Altamont. "It is 5,891 quadrillions of tons." "Good," said Johnson, "those numbers have no meaning." "For that reason, Johnson, I was going to give you 2 comparisons which you could remember. Don't forget that it would take 75 moons to make the Sun, and 350,000 Earths to make up the weight of the Sun." "That is tremendous," said Altamont. "Tremendous is the word," answered the doctor, "but, to return to the pole, no lesson on cosmography on this part of the globe could be more opportune, if it doesn't weary you." "Go on, doctor, go on." "I told you," resumed the doctor, who took as much pleasure in giving as the others did in receiving instruction, "I told you that the pole was motionless in comparison with the rest of the globe." "Well, that is not quite true." "What?" said Bell. "Has that got to be taken back?" "Yes, Bell, the pole is not always exactly in the same place. Formerly the North Star was farther from the celestial pole than it is now. So our pole has a certain motion. It describes a circle in about 26 years. That comes from the precession of the equinoxes, of which I shall speak soon." "But," asked Altamont, "might it not happen that some day the pole should get farther from its place?" "Ah, my dear Altamont," answered the doctor, "you bring up there a great question, which scientific men investigated for a long time in consequence of a singular discovery." "What was that?" "This is it. In 1771 the body of a rhinoceros was found on the shore of the Arctic Sea, and in 1799 that of an elephant on the coast of Siberia. How did the animals of warm countries happen to be found in these latitudes? Thereupon there was much commotion among geologists, who were not so wise as a Frenchman, M. Elie de Beaumont, has been since. He showed that these animals used to live in rather high latitudes, and that the streams and rivers simply carried their bodies to the places where they were found. But do you know the explanation which scientific men gave before this one?" "Scientific men are capable of anything," said Altamont. "Yes, in explanation of a fact. Well, they imagined that the pole used to be at the equator and the equator at the pole." "Bah! It was exactly what I tell you. Now, if it had been so, since the Earth is flattened more than 5 leagues at the pole, the seas, carried to the equator by centrifugal force, would have covered mountains twice as high as the Himalayas, all the countries near the polar circle, Sweden, Norway, Russia, Siberia, Greenland, and New Britain, would have been buried in 5 leagues of water, while the regions at the equator, having become the pole, would have formed plateaus 15 leagues high. "What a change," said Johnson. "Oh, that made no difference to scientific men." "And how did they explain the alteration?" asked Altamont. "They said it was due to the shock of collision with a comet. The comet is the deus ex machina. Whenever one comes to a difficult question in cosmography, a comet is lugged in. It is the most obliging of the heavenly bodies, and at the least sign from a scientific man it disarranges itself to arrange everything." "Then," said Johnson, "according to you, Doctor, this change is impossible." "Impossible? And if it should take place?" "If it did, the equator would be frozen in 24 hours. "Good." "If it were to take place now," said Bell, "people would as likely as not say we had never gone to the pole." "Calm yourself, Bell. To return to the immobility of the terrestrial axis, the following is the result. If we were to spend a winter here, we should see the stars describing a circle about us. As for the sun, the day of the vernal equinox, March 23d, it would appear to us, I take no account of refraction, exactly cut in two by the horizon, and would rise gradually in longer and longer curves, but here it is remarkable that when it has once risen it sets no more, it is visible for 6 months. Then its disk touches the horizon again at the autumnal equinox, September 22d, and as soon as it is set, it is seen no more again all winter. "You were speaking just now of the flattening of the earth at the poles," said Johnson. "Be good enough to explain that, Doctor." "I will. Since the earth was fluid when first created, you understand that its rotary movement would try to drive part of the mobile mass to the equator, where the centrifugal force was greater. If the earth had been motionless, it would have remained a perfect sphere, but in consequence of the phenomenon I have just described, it has an ellipsoidal form, and points at the pole are nearer the center of the earth than points at the equator by about 5 leagues. So, said Johnson, if our captain wanted to take us to the center of the earth, we should have 5 leagues less to go. Exactly, my friend. Well, Captain, it's so much gained. We ought to avail ourselves of it. But Hatteras did not answer. Evidently he had lost all interest in the conversation, or perhaps he was listening without hearing. Well, answered the doctor, according to certain scientific men, it would be worthwhile to try this expedition. What? Really? Exclaimed Johnson. But let me finish, answered the doctor. I will tell you. I must first tell you this flattening of the poles is the cause of the precession of the equinoxes, that is to say, why every year the vernal equinox comes a day sooner than it would if the earth were perfectly round. This comes from the attraction of the sun operating in a different way on the heaped-up land of the equator, which then experiences a retrograde movement. Subsequently it displaces this pole a little, as I just said. But, independently of this effect, this flattening ought to have a more curious and more personal effect, which we should perceive if we had mathematical sensibility. What do you mean? Asked Bell. I mean that we are heavier here than at Liverpool. Heavier? Yes, ourselves, the dogs, our guns, and instruments. Is it possible? Certainly, and for 2 reasons. The first is, that we are nearer the center of the globe, which consequently attracts us more strongly, and this force of gravitation is nothing but weight. The second is, the rotary force, which is nothing at the pole, is very marked at the equator, and objects there have a tendency to fly from the earth, they are less heavy. What? Exclaimed Johnson, seriously, have we not the same weight everywhere? No, Johnson, according to Newton's law, bodies attract one another directly as their masses, and inversely to the square of their distances. Here I weigh more, because I am nearer the center of attraction, and on another planet I should weigh more or less according to the mass of the planet. What? Said Bell, in the moon? In the moon my weight, which is 200 pounds at Liverpool, would be only 32 pounds. And in the sun? Oh, in the sun I should weigh more than 5,000 pounds. Heavens, said Bell, you'd need a derrick to move your legs. Probably, answered the doctor, laughing at Bell's amazement, but here the difference is imperceptible, and by an equal effort of the muscles Bell would leap as high as on the docks at Liverpool. Yes, but in the sun, urged Bell. My friend, answered the doctor, the upshot of it all is that we are well off where we are, and need not want to go elsewhere. You said just now, resumed Altamont, that perhaps it would be worthwhile to make a journey to the center of the world. Has such an undertaking ever been thought of? Yes, and this is all I'm going to say about the pole. There is no point in the world which has given rise to more chimeras and hypotheses. The ancients, in their ignorance, placed the Garden of the Hesperides there. In the Middle Ages it was supposed that the earth was upheld on axles placed at the poles, on which it revolved, but when comets were seen moving freely, that idea had to be given up. Later, there was a French astronomer, Bailly, who said that the lost people mentioned by Plato, the Atlantides, lived here. Finally, it has been asserted in our own time that there was an immense opening at the poles, from which came the northern lights, and through which one could reach the inside of the earth, since in the hollow sphere 2 planets, Pluto and Proserpine, were said to move, and the air was luminous in consequence of the strong pressure it felt. That has been maintained, asked Altamont. Yes, it has been written about seriously. Captain Sims, a countryman of ours, proposed to Sir Humphrey Davy, Humboldt, and Arago to undertake the voyage. But they declined. And they did well. I think so. Whatever it may be, you see, my friends, that the imagination has busied itself about the pole, and that sooner or later we must come to the reality. At any rate, we shall see for ourselves, said Johnson, who clung to his idea. Then, tomorrow we'll start, said the doctor, smiling at seeing the old sailor but half convinced, and if there is any opening to the center of the earth, we shall go there together. Chapter 25. Mount Hatteras. After this solid conversation every one made himself as comfortable as possible in the cavern, and soon fell asleep. Every one, that is, except Hatteras. Why did not this strange man sleep? Was not the object of his life attained? Had he not accomplished the bold projects which lay so near his heart? Why did not calmness succeed the agitation in his ardent mind? Would not one suppose that, when he had accomplished this end, Hatteras would fall into a sort of dejection, and that his overstretched nerves would seek repose? After succeeding, it would seem natural that he should be seized with the feeling of sadness, which always follows satisfied desires. But no. He was only more excited. It was not, however, the thought of returning which agitated him so. Did he wish to go farther? Was there no limit to his ambition, and did he find the world too small, because he had been around it? However this may have been, he could not sleep. And yet this first night spent at the pole of the world was pleasant and quiet. The island was absolutely uninhabited. There was not a bird in its fire-impregnated atmosphere, not an animal on the soil of cinders, not a fish in its boiling waters. Only afar off the dull murmur of the mountain, from the summit of which arose puffs of hot smoke. When Bell, Johnson, Altamont, and the doctor awoke, Hatteras was not to be seen near them. Being anxious, they left the cave, and saw the captain standing on a rock. His eyes were fixed on the top of the volcano. He held his instruments in his hands, having evidently been calculating the exact height of the mountain. The doctor went up to him and spoke to him several times before he could rouse him from his reverie. At last the captain seemed to understand him. "Forward," said the doctor, who was examining him attentively, "forward. Let us explore our island, we are all ready for our last excursion." "Our last," said Hatteras, with the intonation of people who are dreaming aloud. "Yes, the last, indeed. But also," he continued with great animation, "the most wonderful." He spoke in this way, rubbing his hands over his brow as if to allay its throbbing. At that moment, Altamont, Johnson, and Bell joined him. Hatteras appeared to awaken from his reverie. "My friends," he said with emotion, "thanks for your courage, thanks for your perseverance, thanks for your superhuman efforts, which have allowed us to set foot on this land." "Captain," said Johnson, "we have only obeyed, all the honor is due to you alone." "No, no," resumed Hatteras with emotion, "to you as much as to me. To Altamont as well as to all of us. As to the doctor himself, oh, let my heart well over in your hands. It can no longer restrain its joy and gratitude." Hatteras clasped the hands of his companions. He walked to and fro, no longer master of himself. "We have only done our duty as Englishmen," said Bell. "Our duty as friends," continued the doctor. "Yes," said Hatteras, "but all have not performed this duty. Some have given way. Still, they must be pardoned, both who were treacherous and those who were led away to it. Poor men! I forgive them. You understand me, doctor?" "Yes," answered the doctor, who was very uneasy at Hatteras's excitement. "So," went on the captain, "I don't want them to lose the money they came so far to seek. No, I shall not alter my plan. They shall be rich if they ever see England again." Few could have withstood the tenderness with which Hatteras spoke these last words. "But, Captain," said Johnson, with an effort at pleasantry, "one would say you were making your will." "Perhaps I am," answered Hatteras, seriously. "Still you have before you a long and glorious life," continued the old sailor. "Who can say?" said Hatteras. A long silence followed these words. The doctor did not dare to try to interpret the last remark. But Hatteras soon expressed his meaning, for in a hasty, hardly restrained voice, he went on, My friends, listen to me. We have done a good deal so far, and yet there is a good deal to do." His companions gazed at him in astonishment. "Yes, we are on the land of the pole, but we are not on the pole itself." "How so?" asked Altamont. "You don't mean it," cried the doctor, anxiously. "Yes," resumed Hatteras, earnestly, "I said that an Englishman should set foot on the pole. I said it, and an Englishman shall do it." "What?" ejaculated the doctor. "We are now 45 seconds from the unknown point," Hatteras went on, with increasing animation, "where it is, I am going." "But that is the top of the volcano," said the doctor. "I'm going." "It's an inaccessible spot." "I'm going." "It's a fiery crater." "I'm going." The firmness with which Hatteras uttered these words cannot be given. His friends were stupefied. They gazed with horror at the volcano tipped with flame. Then the doctor began. He urged and besought Hatteras to give up his design. He said everything he could imagine, from entreaty to well-meant threats, but he obtained no concession from the nervous captain, who was possessed with a sort of madness which may be called polar madness. Only violent means could stop him, rushing to his ruin. But seeing that thereby they would produce serious results, the doctor wished to keep them for a last resource. He hoped, too, that some physical impossibility, some unsurmountable difficulty, would compel him to give up his plan. "Since it is so," he said, "we shall follow you." "Yes," answered the captain, "halfway up the mountain." "No farther." "Haven't you got to carry back to England the copy of the document which proves our discovery, in case?" "Still." "It is settled," said Hatteras, in a tone of command, "and since my entreaties as a friend are not enough, I order it as captain." The doctor was unwilling to urge him any further, and a few moments later the little band, equipped for a hard climb, and preceded by Duke, set out. The sky was perfectly clear. The thermometer stood at 52 degrees. The air had all the brilliancy which is so marked at this high latitude. It was 8 o'clock in the morning. Hatteras went ahead with his dog, the others followed close behind. "I'm anxious," said Johnson. "No, no, there's nothing to fear," answered the doctor, "we are here." It was a strange island, in appearance so new and singular. The volcano did not seem old, and geologists would have ascribed a recent date to its formation. The rocks were heaped upon one another, and only kept in place by almost miraculous balancing. The mountain, in fact, was composed of nothing but stones that had fallen from above. There was no soil, no moss, no lichen, no trace of vegetation. The carbonic acid from the crater had not yet had time to unite with the hydrogen of the water, nor the ammonia of the clouds, to form under the action of the light, organized matter. This island had arisen from successive volcanic eruptions. Like many other mountains, what they have hurled forth has built them up. For instance, Etna has poured forth a volume of lava larger than itself, and the Monte Nuovo, near Naples, was formed by ashes in the short space of 48 hours. The heap of rocks composing Queen's Island had evidently come from the bowels of the earth. Formerly the sea covered it all. It had been formed long since by the condensation of the vapor on the cooling globe, but in proportion as the volcanoes of the old and new world disappeared, they were replaced by new craters. In fact, the Earth can be compared to a vast spheroidal boiler. Under the influence of the central fire, an immense quantity of vapor is generated, which is exposed to a pressure of thousands of atmospheres, and which would blow up the globe, were it not for the safety valves opening on the outside. These safety valves are the volcanoes. When one closes, another opens, and at the poles, where, doubtless in consequence of the flattening of the Earth's surface, the crust is thinner, it is not strange that a volcano should be suddenly formed by the upheaval of the bottom of the waves. The doctor noticed all this as he followed Hatteras. His foot sank into a volcanic tufa, and the deposits of ashes, volcanic stones, etc., like the syenite and granite of Iceland. But he attributed a comparatively recent origin to the island, on account of the fact that no sedimentary soil had yet formed upon it. Water, too, was lacking. If Queen's Island had existed for several years, there would have been springs upon it, as there are in the neighborhood of volcanoes. Now, not only was there no drop of water there, but the vapors which arose from the stream of lava seemed absolutely anhydrous. This island, then, was of recent formation, and since it appeared in one day, it might disappear in another and sink beneath the ocean. The ascent grew more difficult the higher they went. The sides of the mountain became nearly perpendicular, and they had to be very careful to avoid accident. Often columns of cinders were blown about them and threatened to choke them, or torrents of lava barred their path. On some such places these streams were hard on top, but the molten stream flowed beneath. Each one had to test it first to escape sinking into the glowing mass. From time to time the crater vomited forth huge red-hot rocks amid burning gases. Some of these bodies burst in the air like shells, and the fragments were hurled far off in all directions. The innumerable dangers of this ascent may be readily perceived, as well as the foolhardiness of the attempt. Still, Hatteras climbed with wonderful agility, and while spurning the use of his iron-tipped staff, he ascended the steepest slopes. He soon reached a circular rock, which formed a sort of plateau about 10 feet broad. A glowing stream surrounded it, which was divided at the corner by a higher rock, and left only a narrow passage through which Hatteras slipped boldly. There he stopped, and his companions were able to join him. Then he seemed to estimate the distance yet remaining. Horizontally there were only about 600 feet of the crater remaining, that is to say, from the mathematical point of the pole, but vertically they had 1,500 feet yet to climb. The ascent had already taken 3 hours. Hatteras did not seem tired, his companions were exhausted. The top of the volcano seemed inaccessible. The doctor wished at any risk to keep Hatteras from going higher. At first he tried gentle means, but the captain's excitement amounted to delirium. On the way he had exhibited all the signs of growing madness, and whoever has known him in the different scenes of his life cannot be surprised. In proportion as Hatteras rose above the ocean his excitement increased. He lived no longer with men, he thought he was growing larger with the mountain itself. "Hatteras," said the doctor, "this is far enough. We can't go any farther." "Stay where you are, then," answered the captain in a strange voice. "I shall go higher." "No. That's useless. You are at the pole here." "No, no, higher. My friend, it's I who am speaking to you, Dr. Clawbonny. Don't you know me?" "Higher." "Higher," repeated the madman. "Well, no, we shan't let." The doctor had not finished the sentence before Hatteras, by a violent effort, sprang over the stream of lava and was out of their reach. They uttered a cry, thinking Hatteras was lost in the fiery abyss, but he had reached the other side, followed by Duke, who was unwilling to abandon him. He disappeared behind a puff of smoke, and his voice was heard growing fainter and fainter in the distance. To the north, he was shouting, to the top of Mount Hatteras. Do you remember Mount Hatteras? They could not think of getting up to him. There were 20 chances to 1 against their being able to cross the stream he had leaped over with the skill and luck of madmen. Nor could they get around it. Altamont in vain tried to pass. He was nearly lost in trying to cross the stream of lava. His companions were obliged to hold him by force. "Hatteras, Hatteras," shouted the doctor. But the captain did not answer. Duke's barking alone was heard upon the mountain. Still, Hatteras could be seen at intervals through the column of smoke and the showers of cinders. Sometimes his arm or head would emerge from the whirlwind. Then he would disappear and be seen again higher up in the rocks. His height diminished with the fantastic swiftness of objects rising in the air. Half an hour later he seemed but a fraction of his usual size. The air was filled with the dull noises of the volcano, the mountain was roaring like a boiler, its sides were quivering. Hatteras kept on, and Duke followed. From time to time some enormous rock would give way beneath them and go crashing down to the sea. But Hatteras did not look back. He had made use of his staff as a pole on which to fasten the English flag. His companions observed every one of his movements. His dimensions became gradually smaller, and Duke seemed no larger than a rat. One moment the wind seemed to drive down upon them a great wave of flame. The doctor uttered a cry of anguish, but Hatteras reappeared, standing and brandishing the flag. This sight lasted for more than an hour of struggle with the trembling rocks, with the beds of ashes into which this madman would sink up to the waist. Now he would be climbing on his knees and making use of every inequality in the mountain, and now he would hang by his hands at some sharp corner, swinging in the wind like a dry leaf. At last he reached the top, the yawning mouth of the crater. The doctor then hoped that the wretched man, having attained his object, would perhaps return and have only those dangers before him. He gave a last shout. "Hatteras! Hatteras!" The doctor's cry moved the American's heart so that he cried out, "I will save him." Then with one leap crossing the fiery torrent at the risk of falling in, he disappeared among the rocks. Clawbonny did not have time to stop him. Still, Hatteras, having reached the top, was climbing on top of a rock which overhung the abyss. The stones were raining about him. Duke was still following him. The poor beast seemed already dizzy at the sight beneath him. Hatteras was whirling about his head the flag, which was lighted with the brilliant reflection, and the red bunting could be seen above the crater. With one hand Hatteras was holding it, with the other he was pointing to the zenith, the celestial pole. Still he seemed to hesitate. He was seeking the mathematical point where all the meridians meet, and on which in his sublime obstinacy he wanted to set his foot. Suddenly the rock gave way beneath him. He disappeared. A terrible cry from his companions rose even to the summit of the mountain. A second, a century, passed. Clawbonny considered his friend lost and buried forever in the depths of the volcano. But Altamont was there, and Duke too. The man and the dog had seized him just when he was disappearing in the abyss. Hatteras was saved in spite of himself, and half an hour later the captain of the Forward lay unconscious in the arms of his despairing friends. When he came to himself, the doctor gave him a questioning glance in mute agony. But his vague look, like that of a blind man, made no reply. "Heavens," said Johnson, "he is blind." "No," answered Clawbonny. "No. My poor friends, we have saved Hatteras's body. His mind is at the top of the volcano. He has lost his reason." "Mad," cried Johnson and Altamont in deep distress. "Mad," answered the doctor. And he wept bitterly. Chapter 26. Return to the South. 3 hours after this sad conclusion to the adventures of Captain Hatteras, Clawbonny, Altamont, and the 2 sailors were assembled in the cavern at the foot of the volcano. Then Clawbonny was asked to give his opinion on what was to be done. "My friends," he said, "we cannot prolong our stay at Queen's Island. The sea is open before us. Our provisions are sufficient, we must set out and reach Fort Providence as soon as possible, and we can go into winter quarters till next summer." "That is my opinion," said Altamont, "the wind is fair, and tomorrow we shall set sail." The day passed in great gloom. The captain's madness was a sad foreboding, and when Johnson, Bell, and Altamont thought of their return, they were afraid of their loneliness and remoteness. They felt the need of Hatteras's bold soul. Still, like energetic men, they made ready for a new struggle with the elements and with themselves, in case they should feel themselves growing faint-hearted. The next day, Saturday, July 13th, the camping materials were put on the boat, and soon everything was ready for their departure. But before leaving this rock forever, the doctor, following Hatteras's intentions, put up a cairn at the place where the captain reached the island. This cairn was built of large rocks laid on one another, so as to form a perfectly visible landmark if it were not destroyed by the eruption. On one of the lateral stones bell carved with a chisel this simple inscription, John Hatteras 1861. A copy of the document was placed inside of the cairn in an hermetically sealed tin cylinder, and the proof of this great discovery was left here on these lonely rocks. Then the 4 men and the captain, a poor body without a mind, and his faithful Duke, sad and melancholy, got into the boat for the return voyage. It was 10 o'clock in the morning. A new sail was set up with the canvas of the tent. The launch, sailing before the wind, left Queen's Island, and that evening the doctor, standing on his bench, waved a last farewell to Mount Hatteras, which was lighting up the horizon. Their voyage was very quick. The sea, which was always open, was easy sailing, and it seemed really easier to go away from the pole than to approach it. But Hatteras was in no state to understand what was going on about him. He lay at full length in the launch, his mouth closed, his expression dull, and his arms folded. Duke lay at his feet. It was in vain that the doctor questioned him. Hatteras did not hear him. For 48 hours the breeze was fair and the sea smooth. Clawbonny and his companions rejoiced in the north wind. July 15th, they made Altamont Harbour in the south, but since the polar ocean was open all along the coast, instead of crossing New America by sledge, they resolved to sail around it and reach Victoria Bay by sea. This voyage was quicker and easier. In fact, the space which had taken them a fortnight on sledges took them hardly a week by sail, and after following the rugged outline of the coast, which was fringed with numerous fjords, and determining its shape, they reached Victoria Bay, Monday evening, July 23d. The launch was firmly anchored to the shore, and each one ran to Fort Providence. The doctor's house, the stores, the magazine, the fortifications, all had melted in the sun, and the supplies had been devoured by hungry beasts. It was a sad sight. They were nearly at the end of their supplies, and they had intended to renew them at Fort Providence. The impossibility of passing the winter there was evident. Like people accustomed to decide rapidly, they determined to reach Baffin's Bay as soon as possible. "We have nothing else to do," said the doctor. "Baffin's Bay is not 600 miles from here. We might sail as far as our launch would carry us, reach Jones's Sound, and from there the Danish settlements." "Yes," answered Altamont, "let us collect all the provisions we can and leave." By strict search they found a few chests of pemmican here and there, and 2 barrels of preserved meat, which had escaped destruction. In short, they had a supply for 6 weeks, and powder enough. This was promptly collected. The day was devoted to caulking the launch, repairing it, and the next day, July 24th, they put out to sea again. The continent towards latitude 83 degrees inclined towards the east. It was possible that it joined the countries known under the name of Grinnell Land, Ellesmere, and North Lincoln, which formed the coastline of Baffin's Bay. They could then hold it for certain that Jones's Sound opened in the inner seas, like Lancaster Sound. The launch then sailed without much difficulty, easily avoiding the floating ice. The doctor, by way of precaution against possible delay, put them all on half rations, but this did not trouble them much, and their health was unimpaired. Besides, they were able to shoot occasionally. They killed ducks, geese, and other game, which gave them fresh and wholesome food. As for their drink, they had a full supply from the floating ice, which they met on the way, for they took care not to go far from the coast, the launch being too small for the open sea. At this period of the year the thermometer was already, for the greater part of time, beneath the freezing point. After a certain amount of rainy weather snow began to fall, with other signs of the end of summer. The sun sank nearer the horizon, and more of its disk sank beneath it every day. July 30th they saw it disappear for the first time, that is to say, they had a few minutes of night. Still, the launch sailed well, sometimes making from 60 to 75 miles a day. They did not stop a moment. They knew what fatigues to endure, what obstacles to surmount. The way by land was before them, if they had to take it, and these confined seas must soon be closed. Indeed, the young ice was already forming here and there. Winter suddenly succeeds summer in these latitudes. There are no intermediate seasons, no spring, no autumn. So they had to hurry. July 31st, the sky being clear at sunset, the first stars were seen in the constellations overhead. From this day on there was perpetual mist, which interfered very much with their sailing. The doctor, when he saw all the signs of winter's approach, became very uneasy. He knew the difficulties Sir John Ross had found in getting to Baffin's Bay, after leaving his ship, and indeed, having once tried to pass the ice, he was obliged to return to his ship, and go into winter quarters for the 4th year, but he had at least a shelter against the weather, food, and fuel. If such a misfortune were to befall the survivors of the Forward, if they had to stop or put back, they were lost. The doctor did not express his uneasiness to his companions, but he urged them to get as far eastward as possible. Finally, August 15th, after 30 days of rather good sailing, after struggling for 48 hours against the ice, which was accumulating, after having imperiled their little launch 100 times, they saw themselves absolutely stopped, unable to go farther. The sea was all frozen, and the thermometer marked on an average plus 15 degrees. Moreover, in all the north and east it was easy to detect the nearness of land. By the presence of pebbles, frozen fresh water was found more frequently. Altamont made an observation with great exactness, and found they were in latitude 77 degrees and 15 minutes, and longitude 85 degrees and 2 minutes. So, then, said the doctor, this is our exact position. We have reached North Lincoln, exactly at Cape Eden. We are entering Jones's Sound. If we had been a little luckier, we should have found the sea open to Baffin's Bay. But we need not complain. If my poor Hatteras had at first found so open a sea, he would have soon reached the pole, his companions would not have deserted him, and he would not have lost his reason under his terrible sufferings. Then, said Altamont, we have only one course to follow, to abandon the launch, and get to the east coast of Lincoln by sledge. Abandon the launch and take the sledge? Well, answered the doctor, but instead of crossing Lincoln, I propose going through Jones's Sound on the ice, and reaching North Devon. And why? Asked Altamont. Because we should get nearer to Lancaster Sound, and have more chance of meeting whalers. You are right, doctor, but I am afraid the ice is not yet hard enough. We can try, said Clawbonny. The launch was unloaded, Bell and Johnson put the sledge together, all its parts were in good condition. The next day the dogs were harnessed in, and they went along the coast to reach the ice field. Then they began again the journey which has been so often described. It was tiresome and slow. Altamont was right in doubting the strength of the ice. They could not go through Jones's Sound, and they had to follow the coast of Lincoln. August 21st they turned to one side and reached the entrance of Glacier Sound. Then they ventured upon the ice field, and the next day they reached Cubberg Island, which they crossed in less than 2 days amid snow squalls. They could advance more easily on the ice fields, and at last, August 24th, they set foot on North Devon. Now, said the doctor, we have only to cross this, and reach Cape Warrender, at the entrance of Lancaster Sound. But the weather became very cold and unpleasant. The snow squalls became as violent as in winter. They all found themselves nearly exhausted. Their provisions were giving out, and each man had but a third of a ration, in order to allow to the dogs enough food in proportion to their work. The nature of the ground added much to the fatigue of the journey. North Devon was far from level. They had to cross the Trouter Mountains by almost impassable ravines, struggling against all the fury of the elements. The sledge, men, and dogs had to rest, and more than once despair seized the little band, hardened as it was to the fatigues of a polar journey. But, without their noticing it, these poor men were nearly worn out, physically and morally. They could not support such incessant fatigue for 18 months with impunity, nor such a succession of hopes and despairs. Besides, it should be borne in mind that they went forward with enthusiasm and conviction, which they lacked when returning. So they with difficulty dragged on. They walked almost from habit, with the animal energy left almost independent of their will. It was not until August 30th that they at last left the chaos of mountains, of which one can form no idea from the mountains of lower zones, but they left it half dead. The doctor could no longer cheer up his companions, and he felt himself breaking down. The Trouter Mountains ended in a sort of rugged plain, heaped up at the time of the formation of the mountains. There they were compelled to take a few days of rest. The men could not set one foot before another. 2 of the dogs had died of exhaustion. They sheltered themselves behind a piece of ice, at a temperature of -2 degrees. No one dared put up the tent. Their food had become very scanty, and, in spite of their extreme economy with their rations, they had a supply for but a week more. Game became rarer, having left for a milder climate. Starvation threatened these exhausted men. Altamont, who all along had shown great devotion and unselfishness, took advantage of the strength he had left and resolved to procure by hunting some food for his companions. He took his gun, called Duke, and strode off for the plains to the north. The doctor, Johnson, and Bell saw him go away without much interest. For an hour they did not once hear his gun, and they saw him returning without firing a single shot, but he was running as if in great alarm. "What is the matter?" asked the doctor. "There, under the snow," answered Altamont in great alarm, indicating a point in the horizon. "What?" "A whole band of men alive. Dead, frozen, and even." The American durst not finish his sentence, but his face expressed clearly his horror. The doctor, Johnson, Bell, aroused by this incident, were able to rise and drag themselves along in Altamont's footprints to the part of the plain to which he had pointed. They soon reached a narrow space at the bottom of a deep ravine, and there a terrible sight met their eyes. Bodies were lying half buried beneath the snow, here an arm, there a leg, or clinched hands, and faces still preserving an expression of despair. The doctor drew near, then he stepped back, pale and agitated, while Duke barked mournfully. "Horror," he said. "Well?" asked the boatswain. "Didn't you recognize them?" said the doctor in a strange voice. "What do you mean?" "Look!" This ravine had been the scene of the last struggle between the men and the climate, despair, and hunger, for from some horrible signs it was easy to see that they had been obliged to eat human flesh. Among them the doctor had recognized Shandon, Penn, and the wretched crew of the Forward. Their strength and food had failed them, their launch had probably been crushed by an avalanche, or carried into some ravine, and they could not take to the open sea. Probably they were lost among these unknown continents. Besides, men who had left in mutiny could not long be united with the closeness which is necessary for the accomplishment of great things. A ringleader of a revolt has never more than a doubtful authority in his hands. And, without doubt, Shandon was promptly deposed. However that may have been, the crew had evidently undergone 1,000 tortures, 1,000 despairs, to end with this terrible catastrophe, but the secret of their sufferings is forever buried beneath the Arctic snows. "Let us flee," cried the doctor. And he dragged his companions far from the scene of the disaster. Horror lent them momentary strength. They set out again. Chapter 27. Conclusion. Why linger over the perpetual sufferings of the survivors? They themselves could never recall to their memory a clear vision of what had happened in the week after their horrible discovery of the remains of the crew. However, September 9th, by a miracle of energy, they reached Cape Horsburgh, at the end of North Devon. They were dying of hunger. They had not eaten for 48 hours, and their last meal had been the flesh of their last Eskimo's dog. Bell could go no farther, and old Johnson felt ready to die. They were on the shore of Baffin's Bay, on the way to Europe. 3 miles from land the waves were breaking on the edges of the ice field. They had to await the uncertain passage of a whaler, and how many days yet? But heaven took pity on them, for the next day Altamont clearly saw a sail. The anguish which follows such an appearance of a sail, the tortures of disappointment, are well known. The ship seemed to approach and then to recede. Terrible are the alternations of hope and despair, and too often at the moment the castaways consider themselves saved the sail sinks beneath the horizon. The doctor and his companions went through all these emotions. They had reached the western limit of the ice field, and yet they saw the ship disappear, taking no note of their presence. They shouted, but in vain. Then the doctor had a last inspiration of that busy mind which had served him in such good stead. A floe had drifted against the ice field. "That floe," he said, pointing to it. They did not catch his meaning. "Let us get on it," he cried. They saw his plan at once. "Ah, Clawbonny, Dr. Clawbonny," cried Johnson, kissing the doctor's hands. Bell, with Altamont's aid, ran to the sledge. He brought one of the uprights, stood it up on the floe for a mast, making it fast with ropes. The tent was torn up for a sail. The wind was fair. The poor castaways put out to sea on this frail raft. 2 hours later, after unheard of efforts, the last men of the Forward were taken aboard the Danish whaler Hans Christian, which was sailing to Davis Strait. The captain received kindly these spectres who had lost their semblance to human beings. When he saw their sufferings, he understood their history. He gave them every attention and managed to save their lives. 10 days later, Clawbonny, Johnson, Bell, Altamont, and Captain Hatteras landed at Korsa, in Zealand, in Denmark. A steamboat carried them to Kiel. Thence, via Altona and Hamburg, they reached London the 13th of the same month, hardly recovered from their long sufferings. The first thought of the doctor was to ask permission of the Royal Geographical Society of London to lay a communication before it. He was admitted to the meeting of July 15th. The astonishment of the learned assembly, and its enthusiastic cheers after reading Hatteras's document, may be imagined. This journey, the only one of its kind, went over all the discoveries that had been made in the regions about the pole. It brought together the expeditions of Parry, Ross, Franklin, McClure. It completed the chart between the 100th and 115th meridians, and, finally, it ended with the point of the globe hitherto inaccessible, with the pole itself. Never had news so unexpected burst upon astonished England. The English take great interest in geographical facts. They are proud of them, Lord and Cockney, from the merchant prince to the workman in the docks. The news of this great discovery was telegraphed over the United Kingdom with great rapidity. The papers printed the name of Hatteras at the head of their columns as that of a martyr, and England glowed with pride. The doctor and his companions were feasted everywhere. They were formally presented to Her Majesty by the Lord High Chancellor. The government confirmed the name of Queen's Island for the rock at the North Pole, of Mount Hatteras for the mountain itself, and of Altamont Harbour for the port in New America. Altamont did not part from those whose misery and glory he had shared, and who were now his friends. He followed the doctor, Johnson, and Bell to Liverpool, where they were warmly received, after they had been thought to be long dead, and buried in the eternal ice. But Dr. Clawbonny always gave the glory to the man who most deserved it. In his account of the journey entitled The English at the North Pole, published the next year by the Royal Geographical Society, he made John Hatteras equal to the greatest explorers, the rival of those bold men who sacrifice everything to science. But the sad victim of a lofty passion lived peacefully at the asylum of Star Cottage near Liverpool, where the doctor had placed him. His madness was of a gentle kind, but he never spoke, he understood nothing, his power of speech seemed to have gone with his reason. A single feeling seemed to unite him to the outer world, his love for Duke, who was not separated from him. This disease, this polar madness, pursued its course quietly, presenting no particular symptom, when Dr. Clawbonny, who often visited his poor patient, was struck by his singular manner. For some time Captain Hatteras, followed by his faithful dog, that used to gaze at him sadly, would walk for hours every day, but he always walked in one way, in the direction of a certain path. When he had reached the end, he would return, walking backwards. If anyone stopped him, he would point his finger at a portion of the sky. If anyone tried to make him turn round, he grew angry, and Duke would show his anger and bark furiously. The doctor observed carefully this odd mania. He understood the motive of this strange obstinacy. He guessed the reason of this walk always in the same direction, and, so to speak, under the influence of a magnetic force. Captain John Hatteras was always walking towards the north. The end.